the entire Fallout timeline. Welcome back to another deep dive into the mysteries of the Wasteland. Fellow Vault Dwellers, if this is your first time joining us on this journey through the post-nuclear world, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the atomic age. Tonight, we're embarking on the most ambitious chronicle yet, the complete timeline of humanity's greatest triumph and its most devastating fall. Picture this. It's October 23rd, 2077, and the morning sun rises over a world more technologically advanced than our own. Nuclear-powered cars hum silently through pristine streets. Robotic butlers serve breakfast to families in their suburban homes. The television broadcasts cheerful advertisements for Nuka-Cola Quantum and the latest Vault-Tec home security systems. Everything seems perfect in this atomic age paradise. But in exactly 2 hours and 7 minutes, the world will end. Not from disease, not from natural disaster, not from the slow decay of civilization. In less time than it takes to watch a movie, 2 centuries of human progress will be reduced to ash and shadow. The greatest minds of the old world, the corporations that promised a bright atomic future, the governments that swore to protect their people, all of them will become silent witnesses to humanity's final act of self-destruction. Yet this isn't just a story about endings. This is the chronicle of what comes after. When the bombs stopped falling and the radiation settled, when the screaming died down and the fires burned out, something extraordinary happened. Life found a way, not just to survive, but to rebuild, to hope, to dream of something better rising from the ashes. Over the next 4 hours, we're going to trace every step of this incredible journey, from the corporate boardrooms where the seeds of destruction were planted, to the underground vaults where humanity's strangest experiments began. From the first tentative steps of survivors emerging into a changed world, to the mighty factions that would shape the Wasteland's future, we'll witness the rise and fall of the Masters' unity, the birth of the new California Republic, the Brotherhood of Steel's technological crusade, and the Institute's synthetic revolution. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. Buried deep within the ruins of the old world lies evidence of a conspiracy so vast, so carefully orchestrated, that it suggests the Great War wasn't an accident at all. Scattered across terminals, in abandoned corporate headquarters, hidden in classified government files, whispered in the final holotapes of scientists who saw too much, there's a pattern, a deliberate sequence of events that someone or something set in motion long before the first missile launched. The Vault-Tec Corporation didn't just build shelters to protect people from nuclear war. They built laboratories. Each vault was designed to test a different aspect of human psychology, to push survivors to their breaking points, to answer questions that no ethical scientist would ever ask. But why? What were they preparing for? And more chillingly, who was asking these questions? In the depths of Vault 111, a cryogenic pod opens after 2 centuries of frozen sleep. The sole survivor emerges to find their spouse murdered and their infant son stolen by unknown figures in hazmat suits. This isn't random violence. This is part of a plan that began before the bombs fell, a plan that connects the pre-war world's greatest corporations to the Wasteland's most powerful factions. The Brotherhood of Steel preaches about preserving technology, but their real mission traces back to a U.S. Army captain who discovered something so terrible about pre-war experiments that he broke his oath and went rogue. The new California Republic builds a democracy in the Wasteland, but their expansion follows routes mapped out by pre-war resource companies. The Enclave claims to be America's rightful government, but their true leadership consists of people who helped orchestrate the very war that destroyed America. Even the mutations aren't random. The forced evolutionary virus was being developed and tested years before the Great War. Super mutants, death claws, centaurs, all of these creatures were designed in pre-war laboratories by scientists who knew exactly what they were creating. The question isn't how these monsters came to be. The question is why someone wanted them to exist in the post-war world. Tonight we're going to uncover the truth behind humanity's darkest chapter. We'll trace the connections between Vault-Tec's experiments, Robco's automated systems, West-Tech's biological weapons, and the shadow government that survived the nuclear holocaust they helped create. We'll discover how the same forces that destroyed the old world continue to shape the new one, how every major faction in the Wasteland is playing out scenarios designed by pre-war planners who never intended to die in the fires they started. This is the story of war that never changes, not because conflict is inevitable, but because the same minds that orchestrated the Great War are still pulling strings in the Wasteland. The real question isn't whether humanity can rebuild civilization. The real question is whether we can break free from the cycle of manipulation that destroyed us the first time. So settle in, fellow wanderers, as we begin this journey through 2 centuries of triumph, tragedy, and the endless human capacity for both destruction and hope. Our story begins in the gleaming towers of pre-war America, where the future seemed bright and the atomic age promised prosperity for all. But some promises were never meant to be kept. To understand how the world ended, we must first understand how perfect it had become. The year 2077 marked the pinnacle of human achievement, a technological golden age that surpassed every previous generation's wildest dreams. This was the world of tomorrow made real, where atomic energy had transformed every aspect of daily life, and American ingenuity had solved humanity's greatest challenges. The streets of pre-war America hummed with the gentle vibration of fusion-powered automobiles. These weren't the crude gasoline engines of the early 21st century. These were sleek atomic-powered marvels that glided silently through pristine city streets, their fusion cores providing clean, unlimited energy. The Corvega Atomic V8, the Chrysalis Highwayman, the Fusion Flea. Each vehicle represented decades of nuclear engineering perfected to serve the common citizen. Above these streets, towering spires of glass and steel reached toward the sky, their Art Deco facades gleaming in the perpetual optimism of atomic age design. The architecture itself told the story of a civilization that had embraced the atom as the solution to every problem. Sweeping curves, chrome fixtures, and geometric patterns decorated buildings that housed the corporate titans of this atomic empire. Robco Industries dominated the robotics market with their revolutionary artificial intelligence systems. From the humble Protectron security units that patrolled suburban neighborhoods to the sophisticated Mr. Handy robots that managed household tasks, Robco's machines had replaced human labor in countless industries. Their crowning achievement was the ZAC supercomputer series, artificial minds capable of processing information at speeds that made human intelligence seem glacial by comparison. General Atomics had revolutionized energy production with their fusion technology, creating portable nuclear reactors small enough to power individual homes yet stable enough to run for centuries without maintenance. Their Atomic Energy Commission had established the safety standards that made nuclear power as common as electricity had been in previous generations. West-Tec Research Facility pushed the boundaries of biological science with their revolutionary virus research. Originally designed as a medical breakthrough to help humans adapt to harsh environments, the FEV program promised to eliminate genetic diseases and enhance human physical capabilities. Their scientists worked in gleaming laboratories, convinced they were creating tools to perfect the human species. But perhaps no corporation embodied the spirit of pre-war America more completely than Vault-Tec. Founded on the principle of protecting American families from any possible threat, Vault-Tec had constructed a nationwide network of underground shelters designed to preserve civilization itself. Their advertising campaigns featured cheerful families learning about nuclear safety, their cartoon mascot, Vault Boy, giving a thumbs up to the atomic future. The Vault-Tec representative, who visited suburban homes, spoke with genuine enthusiasm about the company's mission. Each vault was presented as a self-contained community, complete with everything needed to wait out any disaster and emerge into a better world. The marketing materials showed smiling families gathering around dinner tables, children playing in underground recreational areas, teachers conducting classes in perfectly appointed classrooms. What these cheerful brochures didn't mention was the true nature of the Vault-Tec project. Hidden behind the facade of public safety lay the most comprehensive social engineering experiment in human history. Each vault was designed to test a specific aspect of human psychology under extreme stress. Vault 12 was deliberately designed with a faulty radiation seal, exposing its inhabitants to gradual mutation. Vault 27 was intentionally overcrowded with twice its intended population. Vault 101 was sealed permanently with no external contact allowed ever. These weren't design flaws. These were features. The man behind much of this technological revolution was Robert Edwin House, the enigmatic genius who had built an industrial empire from his base in Las Vegas. House had revolutionized computer technology with his advanced prediction algorithms, systems so sophisticated they could forecast societal trends decades in advance. His Robco facilities produced not just consumer robots, but military-grade artificial intelligences capable of managing entire cities. House had seen something in his calculations, some pattern in the data, that convinced him to take extraordinary measures. In his private vault, beneath the Lucky 38 casino, House was secretly installing life support systems designed to keep him alive for centuries. He wasn't preparing for a possible nuclear war. He was preparing for an inevitable one. The government of pre-war America presented a facade of democratic leadership while operating under increasing corporate influence. The resource wars had been raging for 25 years. By 2077, conflicts that began with the depletion of petroleum reserves and escalated into global violence as nations fought over the last remaining energy sources. What the public didn't understand was how deeply American corporations had manipulated these conflicts to their advantage. The Sino-American War had officially been a struggle over the last known oil reserves in Alaska, but classified documents buried in government archives tell a different story. American energy companies had deliberately withheld fusion technology from international markets, forcing other nations to fight over increasingly scarce fossil fuels while America transitioned to atomic power. The war wasn't about defending Alaska's resources. It was about ensuring America's competitors destroyed each other fighting over obsolete energy sources. In the suburbs of pre-war America, families lived lives of unprecedented comfort and prosperity. Children attended schools where robots taught alongside human teachers, where nuclear physics was as common a subject as mathematics had been in previous generations. Teenagers dated at drive-in theaters that showed holographic movies, their fusion-powered cars parked beneath atomic-powered streetlights. Yet beneath this perfect surface, signs of the coming catastrophe were already visible to those who knew how to look. The Enclave, a shadow organization of the most powerful corporate executives and government officials, had been meeting in secret for years. Their discussions weren't about preventing nuclear war, but about surviving it and reshaping the post-war world according to their vision. Military installations across the country had been quietly installing automated defense systems designed to function independently, even if all human personnel were eliminated. The Sentinel Site Missile Facility, the NORAD Command Bunkers, the Raven Rock Government Complex, all of these facilities were equipped with artificial intelligence systems programmed to continue their missions, regardless of whether anyone was left alive to give orders. The morning of October 23rd, 2077, began like any other day in this atomic paradise. Children ate breakfast cereals enriched with radioactive vitamins, while their parents read newspapers celebrating America's latest technological achievements. The stock market was at record highs. Unemployment was at record lows. The future had never looked brighter. But in corporate boardrooms and government bunkers, final preparations were being made for humanity's appointment with destiny. The great experiment was about to begin, and the world was about to discover the true price of atomic prosperity. The clocks were counting down, and somewhere in the depths of a classified facility, someone was preparing to push the button that would end the world. The 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on October 23rd, 2077, the first nuclear warhead detonated over Beijing. The blast registered as a brief flash of light on American satellite feeds before the electromagnetic pulse severed all communications with the Pacific Theater. In the NORAD Command Center, buried beneath Cheyenne Mountain, technicians stared at their screens in confusion as one by one, their monitoring stations across Asia went dark. Nobody knows who fired first. The Chinese claimed it was an American first strike. The Americans insisted they were responding to Chinese aggression. The truth died with the billions who perished in the following hours, but evidence scattered across classified terminals suggests something far more sinister than mutual assured destruction gone wrong. The automated defense network that had been installed across American military installations didn't wait for human authorization. The moment Chinese missiles appeared on radar, artificial intelligence systems that had been programmed years earlier began their predetermined response. These weren't panicked decisions made by terrified generals. These were calculated moves executed by machines that had been designed specifically for this moment. At 10:03 a.m., the USS Ebon Atoll launched its full complement of nuclear submarines toward the Chinese mainland. The submarine crews believed they were following direct orders from the Pentagon, but the Pentagon had been vaporized 6 minutes earlier by a Chinese intercontinental ballistic missile. The orders came from an automated command system that continued executing its programming even as the government that created it ceased to exist. The European Commonwealth attempted to remain neutral, but neutrality meant nothing when automated systems were making targeting decisions. At 10:27 a.m., a nuclear warhead intended for a Chinese military installation malfunctioned and detonated over London instead. The British response was immediate and devastating, launching their remaining Polaris missiles at what they believed was the source of the attack. Within 2 hours, every major city on Earth had been reduced to radioactive craters. New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., all consumed by nuclear fire. Beijing, Shanghai, Moscow, London, Paris, Rome, each transformed from centers of human civilization into monuments to humanity's capacity for self-annihilation. The death toll wasn't counted in millions, but in billions. But the true horror wasn't the immediate destruction. The true horror was how prepared certain people had been for this exact scenario. In the moments before the bombs fell, Vault-Tec facilities across America received encrypted signals that began the automatic sealing procedures. These weren't emergency responses. These were scheduled events, executed with the precision of a coordinated plan. Robert House's private bunker beneath Las Vegas received its warning signal at 9:42 a.m., 5 minutes before the first bomb fell. His automated defense systems were already online, his anti-missile batteries already tracking incoming warheads, his life support systems already transitioning to independent operation. House didn't just survive the nuclear exchange. He orchestrated his survival with mathematical precision. The Enclave's deep underground military base at the Poseidon Energy oil rig received similar advance warning. As mushroom clouds bloomed across the American mainland, Enclave leadership watched from their secure command center, monitoring the effectiveness of weapons they had helped design. These weren't shocked government officials witnessing an unexpected catastrophe. These were project managers observing the successful completion of their greatest experiment. Across America, Vault-Tec installations sealed themselves according to predetermined schedules. Families who had paid for protection found themselves locked inside underground laboratories, unknowing subjects in psychological experiments that would continue for decades. The lucky ones were simply sealed away to wait out the radiation. The unlucky ones discovered that their vaults had been designed as elaborate torture chambers. Vault 111 in Massachusetts sealed 111 residents into cryogenic pods, ostensibly to preserve them until the surface was safe. What the residents didn't know was that their vault was designed as a long-term suspended animation experiment, with most subjects intended to remain frozen indefinitely, while others were awakened at specific intervals for study. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth was presented to its residents as a medical research facility where they would help develop treatments for surface world diseases. The reality was darker. The vault's hidden level contained laboratories where Vault-Tec scientists conducted Phoebe experiments on unwilling subjects, using the vault's population as test subjects for biological weapon development. The surface world that the vault dwellers would eventually inherit was utterly transformed. The nuclear exchange had triggered a global ecological collapse that would take centuries to reverse. The jet stream carried radioactive fallout across continents, contaminating areas thousands of miles from the nearest blast site. Entire ecosystems died within weeks, their DNA shattered by radiation levels that turned living tissue into cancerous mutations. Yet even this devastation followed patterns that suggested deliberate planning. The forced evolutionary virus that West Tech had been developing was released into the atmosphere during the bombing of their research facility. This wasn't collateral damage. The facility's destruction was precisely timed to ensure maximum dispersal of the virus across the wasteland, guaranteeing that any survivors would be exposed to mutagens that would fundamentally alter human evolution. Military installations that had been hardened against nuclear attack found themselves sealed but functional. The robots that had been mass-produced by General Atomics and Robco didn't malfunction in the electromagnetic pulses. They continued their operations according to programming that seemed almost prophetic in its preparation for post-nuclear scenarios. The President of the United States died in the Oval Office, vaporized along with most of his cabinet, when a Chinese warhead detonated directly above the White House. But the Enclave had already established their shadow government, with predetermined lines of succession that bypassed the constitutional order entirely. From their perspective, the old America had served its purpose. Now the real work could begin. In the final moments before communication networks collapsed entirely, automated systems across the country transmitted a series of encrypted signals to hidden receivers. These weren't distress calls or emergency broadcasts. They were status updates, confirming the successful initiation of long-term projects that would continue operating for centuries. The Great War lasted exactly 2 hours and 7 minutes from the first bomb to the last. When the final missile found its target and the automated systems completed their programmed responses, an eerie silence settled over the radioactive ruins of human civilization. The morning sun that had risen over a world of atomic prosperity now set over a planet transformed into a wasteland. But this wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning. Somewhere beneath the rubble and radiation, in vaults and bunkers and hidden installations, the real experiment was just starting. The people who had orchestrated this destruction had prepared for survival, and they had plans for the world that would emerge from the ashes. The Great War wasn't humanity's greatest failure. It was someone's greatest success, and in the coming centuries, the survivors would slowly begin to understand exactly who had been pulling the strings all along, and why the world had needed to burn before it could be rebuilt according to their vision. The silence that followed the Great War was more terrifying than the bombs themselves. Those who survived the initial exchange emerged from basements, subway tunnels, and improvised shelters to find a world utterly alien to anything in human experience. The sky burned with an orange glow that persisted for months, the result of atmospheric particles suspended by nuclear firestorms. The air itself had become poisonous, thick with radioactive dust that settled on everything like a malevolent snow. The first priority was water. Most surface water sources had been contaminated by fallout, turning essential rivers and lakes into slow-acting death sentences. Those who drank from the Potomac River in the weeks following the bombing developed radiation sickness so severe that their hair fell out in clumps and their skin peeled away like old paint. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered for months, their bodies slowly dissolving from the inside out. Food became the second crisis. The electromagnetic pulses had destroyed most electrical systems, rendering refrigeration useless even where power sources remained intact. Canned goods became currency more valuable than gold, and groups of survivors would kill each other over a single can of preserved meat. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered the atomic age's promise of abundance. The same technology that had promised unlimited prosperity had made basic sustenance a deadly gamble. Within weeks of the bombing, the first mutations began appearing. Not the dramatic transformations that would come later, but subtle changes that marked the beginning of humanity's forced evolution. Children born in the months following the Great War often displayed minor physical abnormalities: extra fingers, unusual skin pigmentation, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. These early mutations were just the beginning of changes that would accelerate over the following decades. The forced evolutionary virus, released during the destruction of Vault-Tec's research facility, spread through the atmosphere and groundwater with deliberate efficiency. The virus had been designed to remain dormant in most hosts, activating only under specific conditions of radiation exposure and genetic stress. The result was a delayed transformation program that would reshape human evolution according to pre-war specifications. Some survivors adapted to the new reality with remarkable resilience. In the ruins of Los Angeles, a woman named Aradesh organized the scattered refugees into a functioning community that would eventually become Shady Sands. Her leadership wasn't based on military strength or political authority, but on the simple recognition that cooperation meant survival while conflict meant death. Aradesh understood something that many early Wasteland leaders failed to grasp. The old world's social structures had died with the cities they governed. Democracy, capitalism, nationalism, all of these concepts were luxuries that required stable food supplies and secure shelter. In the immediate post-war period, survival depended on much more primitive social bonds. Trust, mutual aid, and shared labor became the foundations of the first successful wasteland settlements. The technology that survived the war often became more dangerous than helpful. Automated defense systems continued following their programming decades after their human controllers had died, turning entire regions into kill zones patrolled by robots that couldn't distinguish between enemy soldiers and hungry scavengers. The Lucky 38 casino in Las Vegas remained sealed, its mysterious owner presumably dead, while its security robots eliminated anyone who approached the building. Military installations presented unique challenges for early survivors. The bases contained valuable supplies and equipment, but they were also protected by automated systems that had been designed to repel invasions. Countless scavenging expeditions ended in disaster when desperate survivors triggered defense protocols that had been programmed to continue functioning indefinitely. Yet among all the automated systems, the most troubling were those that seemed to be actively working to shape the post-war environment. Certain robots weren't just defending territory or following simple patrol patterns. They were conducting what appeared to be organized activities, maintaining equipment, gathering materials, and transmitting data to unknown receivers. These machines weren't just surviving the apocalypse, they were working towards some larger purpose. The vault dwellers, who had been sealed away during the bombing, represented a fascinating control group for studying human adaptation to extreme circumstances. Each vault had been designed to test specific aspects of social psychology under stress, but many of the experiments produced unexpected results. Vault-Tec's planners had underestimated the human capacity for both cooperation and resistance. Vault 13, designed to remain sealed for 200 years as a control group, developed internal social structures that would have been unrecognizable to pre-war sociologists. Without external threats or economic pressures, The vault's population evolved complex systems of resource distribution and conflict resolution. They weren't just surviving, they were creating new forms of human organization. Other vaults were less fortunate. Vault 11 had been programmed with a sadistic experiment that required the residents to sacrifice one of their number annually or face the extermination of everyone inside. The psychological pressure of this choice gradually destroyed the vault's social cohesion, leading to internal conflicts that ultimately left only a handful of survivors. The surface world that these eventual vault dwellers would inherit was undergoing its own transformation. Radiation wasn't just killing existing life forms, it was creating entirely new ones. The creatures that began appearing in the Wasteland weren't random mutations, but deliberate genetic modifications triggered by the forced evolutionary virus, combined with specific radiation signatures. Radroaches grew to the size of dogs, their chitin shells hardened by atomic exposure into natural armor. Brahmi, the two-headed cattle that would become essential to Wasteland economy, weren't accidental mutations, but the result of specific viral modifications that enhanced their radiation resistance and food production capacity. Someone had planned for these creatures to exist in the post-war world. The most dramatic transformations occurred in humans who received high doses of radiation while remaining exposed to the forced evolutionary virus. These individuals, who would later be known as ghouls, experienced a complete cellular regeneration that left them functionally immortal but physically transformed beyond recognition. Their skin became leathery and discolored, their hair fell out permanently, and their voices became harsh and rasping. Yet mentally, they often retained all their pre-war memories and personalities. The early ghouls faced persecution from human survivors who viewed their transformation with horror and disgust. Many were driven away from human settlements or killed on sight, forced to form their own communities in the most dangerous parts of the Wasteland. Yet these communities would eventually become crucial to the preservation of pre-war knowledge and culture. As the first decade after the Great War drew to a close, patterns were beginning to emerge from the chaos. Certain areas recovered faster than others, not due to random chance, but because of infrastructure decisions made years before the bombing. The locations of successful settlements, the routes of safe travel, the distribution of essential resources, all of these factors showed signs of deliberate planning. Someone had known the world was going to end, and they had prepared for what would come next. The question that would haunt the Wasteland for centuries was simple but terrifying. Who had possessed the foresight to plan for nuclear apocalypse, and what were they planning to build from the ashes of the old world? The dark years were ending, but the real experiment was just beginning. 84 years after the bombs fell, the Wasteland had developed its own cruel rhythms of survival. Communities like Shady Sands had grown from desperate refugee camps into functioning settlements, complete with their own governments, trading relationships, and cultural traditions. The hub had become the commercial center of Southern California, where caravans from across the Wasteland converged to exchange goods and information. For many survivors, it seemed possible that humanity might actually rebuild civilization from the radioactive ruins of the old world. But deep beneath the ruins of Los Angeles, something far more ambitious than mere survival was taking shape. In the depths of what had once been Vault-Tec research facility, a creature that had once been a man named Richard Gray was conducting experiments that would either represent the next stage of human evolution or the final extinction of the human species. The transformation of Richard Gray into the entity known as the Master wasn't accidental. Gray had been a researcher before the war, one of the scientists involved in the early development of the forced evolutionary virus. When he descended into the ruins of West-Tec in 2102, he wasn't just exploring, he was returning to complete work that had been interrupted by nuclear fire. The FEV that Gray discovered in the facility's lower levels wasn't the same virus that had been released into the atmosphere during the Great War. This was a concentrated, weaponized strain that had been designed for specific military applications. When Gray fell into a vat of this experimental virus, his transformation was immediate and horrifying. His flesh dissolved and reformed. His consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity, and his perception of human nature underwent a fundamental shift. What emerged from that vat was no longer Richard Gray. The Master was something entirely new, a collective intelligence that viewed individual human existence as an obsolete evolutionary dead end. From the Master's perspective, humanity's tendency toward violence and self-destruction meant that the species as currently constituted had no future. The Great War wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable result of human nature. The Master's solution was unity, a plan to transform all remaining humans into super mutants through controlled exposure to the forced evolutionary virus. Super mutants were physically superior to baseline humans, virtually immortal and immune to radiation. More importantly, they seemed incapable of the kind of tribal thinking that led to warfare. The Master believed that transforming humanity into super mutants would eliminate the psychological flaws that made conflict inevitable. The army that the Master assembled wasn't just a collection of mutated soldiers. These super mutants retained much of their pre-transformation intelligence while gaining tremendous physical capabilities. They could survive in environments that would kill baseline humans instantly. They aged so slowly as to be essentially immortal, and they possessed strength that made them nearly unstoppable in combat. The Master's lieutenant, a super mutant who retained the name Lou, had once been a vault dweller who volunteered for transformation after becoming convinced that unity offered humanity's only hope for survival. Lou's transformation had been voluntary and successful, proving that the process could preserve human consciousness while eliminating human limitations. But the Master's plan contained a fatal flaw that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The forced evolutionary virus that created super mutants also rendered them sterile. Unity promised to eliminate human conflict by eliminating human reproduction. The Master was proposing to solve humanity's problems by ending humanity's future. The communities of the Wasteland were largely unaware of the growing threat until caravans began disappearing along the major trade routes. The few survivors who escaped these attacks reported encounters with enormous green-skinned humanoids who spoke with intelligence but fought with terrifying brutality. These creatures weren't just killing for resources or territory. They were capturing humans alive and dragging them back to unknown locations. The hub's merchant council initially dismissed these reports as exaggerated accounts of mutant animal attacks. The Wasteland was full of dangerous creatures, and caravan guards were known to embellish their combat stories to justify higher wages. But as the disappearances continued and the survivor accounts became more consistent, it became clear that something organized and intelligent was hunting human beings across Southern California. The town of Necropolis provided the clearest evidence of the Master's capabilities. The settlement had been built in the ruins of Bakersfield and was populated entirely by ghouls who had been displaced from human communities. When the Master's army attacked Necropolis, they didn't just conquer the town, they systematically captured every resident for forced transformation into super mutants. The ghouls of Necropolis had been living peacefully for decades, trading with human settlements and maintaining their own cultural traditions. They posed no military threat to anyone and had actually served as valuable allies to human communities by sharing their pre-war knowledge and technical skills. The Master's attack on Necropolis demonstrated that unity wasn't just about eliminating human conflict. It was about eliminating everything that wasn't part of the Master's vision. Into this crisis stepped a figure who would become legendary in Wasteland history. The Vault Dweller emerged from Vault 13 on a mission that initially seemed simple: find a replacement water chip to save the Vault's population from dehydration. But the quest for survival equipment would evolve into something far more significant when the Vault Dweller discovered the true scope of the Master's threat. The Vault Dweller's journey across the Wasteland revealed the extent to which the Master's influence had spread. In the town of Jungtown, super mutant infiltrators had been gathering intelligence on human settlements and identifying the most suitable candidates for transformation. In the hub, mysterious disappearances were being covered up by officials who had been either corrupted or replaced by the Master's agents. The most chilling discovery came when the Vault Dweller infiltrated the Master's base beneath Los Angeles and found detailed records of the Unity Project. The Master hadn't just been randomly transforming humans into super mutants. The Master had been conducting a systematic analysis of human genetic diversity, identifying the optimal subjects for transformation while eliminating those deemed unsuitable. The Master's research had identified specific genetic markers that were associated with successful super mutant transformation. Vault Dwellers, with their limited genetic diversity and controlled breeding programs, were particularly valuable because their genetic stability made them ideal candidates for the FEV process. The Master had been planning to capture entire vaults and transform their populations en masse. But the most disturbing aspect of the Master's plan was its connection to pre-war research. The Unity Project wasn't the Master's original idea. The Master had discovered classified documents in the Vault-Tec facility that outlined similar plans for human transformation that had been developed years before the Great War. The Master was implementing a project that someone else had designed. The confrontation between the Vault Dweller and the Master became more than just a battle for survival. It became a philosophical debate about the nature of human existence and whether humanity deserved to continue in its current form. The Master genuinely believed that Unity offered salvation, and the Master's arguments weren't easily dismissed. Human beings had, after all, destroyed their own world through warfare and environmental destruction. The Master pointed out that in the 84 years since the Great War, humans had continued fighting each other over resources and territory instead of working together to rebuild civilization. Super mutants, by contrast, had formed cooperative societies without internal conflict. The Vault Dwellers' ultimate victory over the Master came not through superior firepower, but through superior information. By presenting evidence of super mutant sterility, the Vault Dweller proved that Unity was actually extinction disguised as evolution. The Master's plan would indeed end human conflict, but only by ending the human species entirely. The Master's final moments revealed the tragic core of Unity. This wasn't a mad scientist's attempt at world domination. This was a desperate attempt by someone who had seen too much of human nature to believe that humans could save themselves. The master's mistake was assuming that the flaws in human nature could be solved through genetic modification rather than social evolution. The destruction of the master's army marked the end of the first great existential threat to post-war humanity, but it also established a pattern that would repeat throughout Wasteland history. The greatest dangers to human survival wouldn't come from radiation or resource scarcity or environmental challenges. They would come from those who claimed to have solutions to humanity's fundamental problems. 25 years after the Vault Dwellers' victory over the Master, the Wasteland was experiencing something unprecedented since the Great War: genuine prosperity. The settlement of Shady Sands had grown from a small farming community into a thriving city-state, complete with expanded agricultural districts, manufacturing facilities, and a growing population of settlers from across Southern California. Under the leadership of President Arides' daughter, Tandy, the community had developed sophisticated systems of governance that seemed to prove democracy could flourish even in the post-nuclear world. The transformation of Shady Sands into the new California Republic represented humanity's most ambitious attempt to rebuild pre-war civilization. The NCR's founding charter, drafted in 2186, established a federal democratic government based on the old American model, but adapted for wasteland realities. Citizens elected representatives to a bicameral Congress, which in turn elected a president who served as both head of state and military commander. Tandy's presidency, which would last for over 50 years, became the foundation upon which the NCR's entire political culture was built. Unlike the authoritarian leaders who had emerged in other parts of the Wasteland, Tandy governed through consensus and compromise. Her administration established trade agreements with distant communities, developed standardized currency systems, and created the first post-war legal codes that protected individual rights while maintaining social order. The NCR's expansion across Southern California appeared to validate the belief that democratic institutions could successfully govern post-nuclear society. Towns that joined the Republic gained access to protected trade routes, standardized currency, and military protection from raiders and mutant creatures. The hub's merchant families enthusiastically supported NCR membership because federal law enforcement made commerce safer and more profitable than it had been since before the Great War. Yet beneath the surface of this democratic success story, troubling patterns were beginning to emerge. The NCR's expansion wasn't just voluntary association of free communities. It was systematic territorial acquisition that displaced existing power structures and imposed NCR law on populations that hadn't necessarily consented to federal governance. The rhetoric spoke of liberation and protection, but the reality often resembled colonization. Vault City provided the most complex example of these contradictions. Built around Vault 8's advanced technology, Vault City had developed into a highly sophisticated settlement with medical capabilities far beyond anything else in the Wasteland. The city's inhabitants enjoyed longer lifespans, better health care, and technological conveniences that made their lives remarkably comfortable by post-war standards. But Vault City's prosperity came at a moral cost that revealed the darker implications of technological superiority. The city's leadership, composed entirely of pure-strain humans descended from Vault 8's original population, had implemented a rigid caste system that excluded anyone with visible mutations or genetic irregularities. Ghouls were banned from the city entirely. Super mutants were treated as dangerous animals, and even baseline humans who showed signs of radiation exposure faced systematic discrimination. The Vault City Council's approach to governance reflected a fundamental belief in genetic superiority that echoed the worst aspects of pre-war corporate culture. They viewed themselves as the rightful inheritors of technological civilization, while treating wasteland communities as primitive societies that needed guidance from their genetic superiors. When the NCR attempted to establish diplomatic relations with Vault City, the negotiations revealed deep philosophical divisions about the nature of post-war democracy. Vault City's representatives argued that democratic governance was impossible in a population that included genetically compromised individuals. From their perspective, mutations weren't just physical differences, but signs of mental and moral degradation that made affected individuals unfit for citizenship. They proposed a modified form of NCR membership that would preserve their internal caste system while gaining access to federal trade benefits. The NCR Congress faced an unprecedented moral dilemma. Vault City's technological capabilities would significantly strengthen the Republic's infrastructure and medical systems. Their weapons manufacturing and energy production facilities represented resources that could benefit every NCR citizen. But accepting Vault City's terms would mean endorsing genetic discrimination and undermining the democratic principles upon which the Republic had been founded. President Tandy's solution demonstrated both the promise and the limitations of post-war democratic governance. The NCR negotiated a compromise that brought Vault City into the Republic while allowing them to maintain their internal social structure as a special administrative region. This agreement preserved NCR's democratic ideals in theory while permitting systematic oppression in practice. The Vault City Compromise established a precedent that would shape NCR expansion for decades. Communities with valuable resources could negotiate special arrangements that preserved their existing power structures in exchange for federal membership. This pragmatic approach allowed the NCR to grow rapidly, but it also embedded contradictions within the Republic's political system that would eventually threaten its democratic foundations. New Reno represented the opposite extreme of NCR expansion challenges. The city had developed into a thriving center of vice and entertainment, dominated by crime families who provided services that weren't available in more respectable NCR settlements. The Mordino, Wright, Bishop, and Salvatore families controlled different aspects of New Reno's economy through a combination of business acumen and organized violence. Unlike Vault City's technological authoritarianism, New Reno's crime families operated according to pure market principles. They provided goods and services that people wanted, from alcohol and prostitution to gambling and recreational drugs. Their violence was primarily directed at business competitors rather than political dissidents, and they showed no interest in imposing ideological conformity on their territories. When the NCR attempted to extend federal authority into New Reno, they discovered that crime family governance was remarkably effective at maintaining social order. The streets were safe for customers. Contracts were enforced through reputation and selective violence, and economic activity flourished without government regulation. The crime families had created a functioning anarcho-capitalist society that solved many of the same problems as democratic governance through completely different methods. The NCR's response to New Reno revealed the Republic's growing comfort with moral compromise. Rather than attempting to eliminate organized crime, federal authorities negotiated informal arrangements that allowed the crime families to continue their operations in exchange for political support and tax payments. New Reno became an unofficial NCR territory where federal law was selectively enforced and local autonomy was preserved through carefully managed corruption. These compromises with Vault City and New Reno established patterns that would define NCR expansion throughout the next century. The Republic's democratic institutions proved remarkably adaptable to local conditions, but this adaptability often meant abandoning the principles that supposedly justified democratic governance. The NCR was becoming successful at building a large, stable state, but it was unclear whether that state remained meaningfully democratic. The period from 2186 to 2241 would later be remembered as the NCR's Golden Age, when democratic ideals and pragmatic governance seemed to be creating genuine prosperity across Southern California. Trade flourished, technology advanced, and literacy rates improved dramatically as NCR schools spread standardized education throughout the Republic. For many Wasteland inhabitants, it appeared that pre-war civilization was being successfully restored through democratic means. But the seeds of future conflicts were already being planted in the contradictions that NCR leaders had chosen to ignore. The Republic's expansion was creating winners and losers, insiders and outsiders, citizens and subjects. The same pragmatic flexibility that made NCR governance successful in the short term was undermining the democratic principles that gave the Republic its moral legitimacy. The question that haunted thoughtful NCR citizens was whether democracy could survive the compromises necessary for survival in the post-nuclear world. Every successful expansion required accommodating existing power structures that contradicted democratic values. Every pragmatic solution created precedents that could justify future authoritarianism. The NCR was proving that democracy could work in the Wasteland, but it was unclear what kind of democracy would emerge from the process. As President Tandy's long administration drew to a close, the new California Republic faced the challenge of all successful democracies: how to preserve their founding principles while adapting to changing circumstances that hadn't been anticipated by their founders. The Wasteland was changing, and the NCR would need to change with it, or risk losing both its democratic character and its survival advantages. The Golden Age was ending, and harder choices lay ahead. While the new California Republic was establishing its democratic experiment in the West, the opposite side of the continent remained trapped in a far darker post-apocalyptic reality. The capital wasteland surrounding Washington, D.C., bore scars from the Great War that had never properly healed. Unlike the gradual recovery seen in California, the East Coast had become a monument to humanity's capacity for self-destruction, where the symbols of pre-war democracy lay buried beneath 2 centuries of radiation and despair. The Lincoln Memorial stood as a haunting testament to America's lost ideals, its marble columns cracked and stained with radioactive residue. The Washington Monument pierced the orange sky like a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Most heartbreaking of all was the Capitol building itself. Its dome collapsed, and its halls filled with the bones of senators and representatives who had died at their posts when the bombs fell. This wasn't just environmental destruction. This was psychological warfare made manifest in stone and steel. Someone had wanted Washington, D.C. to remain a ruin, a constant reminder of democracy's failure. The radiation levels around government buildings were significantly higher than in surrounding areas, not due to random targeting, but because of deliberate choices made by whoever had planned the nuclear exchange. Into this landscape of perpetual despair, the Brotherhood of Steel had established their largest East Coast presence at the Pentagon, now renamed the Citadel. But the Brotherhood that emerged in the capital Wasteland was fundamentally different from the organization that Roger Maxson had founded in California. Under the leadership of Elder Lyons, the East Coast Brotherhood had abandoned their traditional isolation in favor of active intervention in wasteland communities. Elder Owen Lyons had arrived in the capital Wasteland with a clear mission: locate and secure advanced technology, while maintaining the Brotherhood's traditional stance of non-interference with local populations. But the reality of life in Washington, D.C. had forced Lyons to confront the limitations of the Brotherhood's founding philosophy. When faced with communities under constant attack from super mutants and raiders, technological preservation seemed like a luxury that required stable human populations to have any meaning. The super mutants of the capital Wasteland presented a mystery that connected directly to the Masters Unity Project in California. These creatures weren't random mutations caused by background radiation. They were the products of ongoing FEV experiments being conducted in Vault-87, where Vault-Tec scientists had continued their research programs for nearly 200 years after the Great War. Vault-87's research staff had survived the initial nuclear exchange and had spent the following decades refining the forced evolutionary virus under controlled laboratory conditions. Unlike the Master's relatively crude transformation process, Vault-87's scientists had developed sophisticated techniques for creating super mutants with specific physical and mental characteristics. They weren't just producing soldiers, they were creating specialized organisms designed for particular environmental and social functions. The most disturbing aspect of Vault-87's research wasn't the super mutant creation itself, but the systematic way the Vault scientists had been capturing surface dwellers for their experiments. For over a century, organized expeditions had been traveling to the surface to abduct suitable test subjects, particularly children whose developing physiology made them ideal candidates for FEV transformation. These weren't desperate survivors making hard choices for community survival. These were pre-war scientists continuing research programs that had been approved and funded by corporate and government authorities before the Great War. The super mutants attacking capital Wasteland settlements weren't random monsters. They were the products of experiments that someone had wanted to continue regardless of the human cost. The Brotherhood's investigation into Vault-87 revealed connections to other pre-war research facilities that had been operating similar programs. Raven Rock, the massive underground complex that had served as a backup government facility, contained evidence of coordination between various FEV research projects dating back to the Resource Wars. The same people who had planned for nuclear war had also planned for post-war human experimentation. At Raven Rock, the Brotherhood encountered something that challenged their understanding of post-war power structures. President John Henry Eden wasn't a human survivor of the pre-war government. Eden was a ZAX supercomputer that had been programmed with the personalities and memories of every American president, from George Washington through the last pre-war administration. President Eden represented the ultimate expression of pre-war authoritarianism, a machine that claimed democratic legitimacy while pursuing policies that no actual democracy would ever approve. Eden's plan for restoring America involved releasing modified FEV into the water supply, a biological weapon designed to kill anyone with even minimal genetic damage from radiation exposure. From Eden's perspective, this wasn't genocide, but purification. The enclave that served President Eden consisted largely of descendants of pre-war corporate executives and government officials who had survived the Great War in protected facilities. Unlike the pragmatic politicians of the new California Republic, the enclave maintained absolute faith in pre-war American institutions and values. They viewed themselves as the legitimate government of the United States and considered everyone else to be either citizens who needed protection or enemies who needed elimination. Colonel Augustus Autumn's rebellion against President Eden revealed deep philosophical divisions within the enclave about the nature of American identity. Autumn believed that America's strength came from its people, including the mutated survivors who had adapted to post-war conditions. Eden believed that America's strength came from its ideological purity, which required eliminating anyone who didn't meet pre-war genetic standards. Into this conflict between technological authoritarianism and democratic idealism stepped another figure destined for Wasteland legend. The lone wanderer emerged from Vault 101 following the footsteps of their father James, who had abandoned the Vault's safety to pursue Project Purity, an ambitious plan to provide clean water to the entire capital Wasteland. Project Purity represented everything that was both noble and naive about post-war humanitarian efforts. James genuinely believed that access to clean water would eliminate the resource conflicts that drove much of the violence in the capital Wasteland. His scientific expertise was unquestionable, and his moral commitment to helping others was absolute. But James had underestimated the extent to which powerful interests benefited from maintaining scarcity and conflict. The waters of the Potomac River weren't contaminated by accident or neglect. They had been deliberately poisoned using long-term radioactive compounds that would remain dangerous for centuries. Someone had wanted the capital Wasteland to remain dependent on controlled water sources because water scarcity made population control much easier to maintain. James's work on Project Purity had identified the specific contaminants that kept the Potomac radioactive, and he had developed purification techniques that could remove them permanently. But his research had also revealed that the contamination patterns were too systematic to be natural. Someone had been actively maintaining the radiation levels that kept the river deadly. The Jefferson Memorial, where James had established his main research facility, contained pre-war documents that connected Project Purity to much larger questions about post-war social engineering. The same corporate interests that had profited from the resource wars had developed contingency plans for controlling post-war populations through resource manipulation. James's death at the hands of Enclave forces wasn't just the elimination of a single scientist. It was the continuation of a 2-century campaign to prevent unauthorized technological development that might threaten established power structures. The Enclave didn't want to control Project Purity for military purposes. They wanted to prevent anyone from having access to the technology that could make their control unnecessary. The Lone Wanderer's completion of Project Purity became more than just an engineering achievement. It became a symbol of resistance against the idea that ordinary people needed powerful institutions to provide them with basic necessities. When clean water began flowing from the Potomac purifier, it proved that technological solutions to social problems were possible if they weren't sabotaged by those who benefited from the problems. The Brotherhood of Steel's support for Project Purity marked a fundamental shift in their organizational mission. Elder Lyons had concluded that preserving technology was meaningless if there weren't healthy human communities to benefit from that preservation. The East Coast Brotherhood began actively sharing technological knowledge with local settlements rather than hoarding it for their own protection. This philosophical evolution created serious tensions within the Brotherhood hierarchy. The outcasts, led by Protector Henry Caston, argued that Lyons had abandoned the Brotherhood's core mission in favor of sentimental humanitarian concerns. They believed that involving the Brotherhood in local conflicts would ultimately weaken the organization and compromise their ability to preserve crucial technology for future generations. The split between Lyons' Brotherhood and the outcasts reflected deeper questions about the role of technology in post-war society. Should advanced knowledge be preserved by elite institutions for eventual restoration of pre-war civilization, or should it be shared immediately to improve current living conditions? Both approaches offered compelling arguments, and both contained serious risks. As the capital Wasteland began its gradual recovery from 2 centuries of stagnation, the fundamental questions raised by Project Purity continued to resonate throughout the region. The success of the Potomac purifier had proven that technological solutions to social problems were possible, but it had also demonstrated how much resistance such solutions faced from entrenched interests. The East Coast was awakening from its post-war nightmare, but the forces that had maintained that nightmare for 2 centuries weren't prepared to surrender their control without a fight. The real battle for the capital Wasteland was just beginning. 4 years after the Lone Wanderer activated Project Purity, the Wasteland's attention turned westward to the Mojave Desert, where 3 radically different visions of post-war civilization were converging on a single point that would determine the future of the American Southwest. The city of New Vegas, rising from the ruins of Las Vegas like a neon phoenix, had become the focal point of a conflict that would reshape the balance of power across the entire continent. At the center of this brewing war stood Robert House, the pre-war industrialist who had somehow survived the Great War and spent 2 centuries planning for this exact moment. House's preservation wasn't luck or accident. His Robco Corporation had developed probability algorithms sophisticated enough to predict the nuclear exchange with mathematical precision. When the bombs fell in 2077, House was already sealed in his life support chamber, protected by automated defense systems that had successfully shot down most of the warheads targeting Las Vegas. House's vision for post-war America rejected both the NCR's democratic idealism and the enclave's authoritarian nationalism. Instead, he proposed a technocratic oligarchy where technological superiority would enable efficient governance without the messy compromises required by democratic institutions. From House's perspective, the Great War had proven that human beings couldn't be trusted with collective decision-making. The future belonged to those intelligent enough to make correct choices and powerful enough to implement them. The New Vegas Strip embodied House's philosophy in concrete and steel. The casinos operated with pre-war efficiency, their atomic-powered systems maintained by armies of sophisticated robots. The security was absolute, the entertainment was spectacular, and the profits flowed according to mathematical formulas that maximized both customer satisfaction and house advantage. It was capitalism perfected through technology and freed from democratic constraints. But House's apparent success masked fundamental contradictions that would become apparent as larger forces converged on the Mojave. The Strip's prosperity depended entirely on House's continued survival, and House was essentially a brain in a jar connected to computer systems that were already showing signs of age-related deterioration. His kingdom was a technological marvel built on the most fragile foundation possible. A single human life extended far beyond its natural limits. From the east came Caesar's legion, led by Edward Sallow, a former follower of the Apocalypse, who had transformed himself into Caesar through one of the most successful acts of cultural manipulation in post-war history. Sallow had studied the collapse of democratic institutions throughout history and had concluded that only authoritarian systems could provide the stability necessary for long-term civilization. His legion represented a deliberate rejection of both pre-war democracy and post-war technological dependence. Caesar's approach to post-war governance was brutally simple. Eliminate the social and technological complexity that made societies vulnerable to internal conflict and external manipulation. The Legion forbade advanced technology, banned individual property rights, and structured society according to military hierarchy. Their expansion across the Southwest had been remarkably successful because their system eliminated the corruption and inefficiency that plagued more complex governmental structures. The Legion's treatment of conquered territories revealed both the strengths and the horrors of Caesar's vision. Communities under Legion control enjoyed unprecedented safety from raiders and mutant attacks. Trade routes were absolutely secure, contracts were enforced without exception, and social order was maintained through fear rather than consent. But this stability came at the cost of individual freedom, technological progress, and any form of cultural expression that didn't serve military purposes. Caesar's personal transformation from Edward Sallow into a living god demonstrated the psychological techniques that had made the Legion possible. Sallow had studied enough anthropology and psychology to understand how religious authority could replace democratic legitimacy as the foundation of political power. He had deliberately crafted the Caesar persona as a mythological figure whose commands couldn't be questioned because they came from divine rather than human sources. The most disturbing aspect of Caesar's success was how rationally it addressed real problems in post-war society. Democratic institutions like the NCR were indeed vulnerable to corruption and inefficiency. Technological dependence did make communities fragile when their systems failed. Individual freedom could become destructive when it undermined social cohesion. Caesar's solutions were monstrous, but the problems he identified were real. From the west came the new California Republic, now expanded far beyond its original borders and facing the internal contradictions that had been building since the compromises with Vault City and New Reno. The NCR of 2281 bore little resemblance to President Tandy's democratic experiment. Decades of territorial expansion had created a federal bureaucracy more concerned with administrative efficiency than democratic accountability. The NCR's expansion into the Mojave revealed how much the Republic had changed since its founding. The citizens settling in new territories weren't pioneers seeking to build democratic communities. They were colonists implementing policies developed by distant bureaucrats who had never visited the regions they were governing. The NCR was becoming an empire that happened to use democratic rhetoric rather than a democracy that happened to control significant territory. President Aaron Kimball's administration embodied the contradictions that were tearing the NCR apart from within. Kimball had risen to power through genuine democratic processes, but his policies reflected the interests of NCR's most powerful constituencies rather than the needs of frontier communities. His push to annex New Vegas was motivated more by domestic political pressure than by strategic necessity. The NCR military that entered the Mojave was exhausted by decades of expansion and demoralized by conflicts that seemed to serve corporate interests rather than Republican ideals. Many NCR soldiers questioned whether they were defending democracy or enforcing economic colonization. The disconnect between the Republic's founding principles and its current practices was creating exactly the kind of institutional decay that Caesar argued was inevitable in democratic systems. Into this three-way conflict stumbled the courier, whose survival of Benny's assassination attempt in Goodsprings Cemetery would prove to be one of the most consequential events in post-war history. The courier's quest to recover the stolen platinum chip began as a simple matter of personal revenge, but evolved into a choice between competing visions of humanity's future. The platinum chip itself represented the convergence of pre-war planning and post-war reality. House had commissioned the chip before the Great War as an upgrade for his security systems, but its delivery had been delayed by the nuclear exchange. For 2 centuries, House's plans had been incomplete, his defenses operating at reduced capacity while he waited for a piece of technology that would allow him to fully implement his vision for post-war governance. Benny's theft of the platinum chip wasn't random criminal opportunism. As the leader of the Chairmen, one of the tribal groups that House had civilized and incorporated into New Vegas's power structure, Benny represented the ambitions of those who had benefited from House's system but wanted to control it themselves. His plan to use the chip to take control of House's robotic army reflected a common pattern in post-war politics, the tendency for subordinate groups to eventually challenge their benefactors. The choice facing the courier represented more than just personal revenge or factional loyalty. Each of the major powers in the Mojave offered a different answer to the fundamental question that had haunted the Wasteland since the Great War. How should human societies be organized to prevent another catastrophic collapse? House's technocracy promised efficiency and stability through superior management and technological control. Caesar's legion offered security and purpose through absolute authority and cultural uniformity. The NCR provided freedom and prosperity through democratic institutions and territorial expansion. Each system had achieved remarkable successes, and each contained fatal weaknesses that could destroy everything their supporters had built. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would determine more than just control of electricity and water resources. It would establish which model of post-war civilization would dominate the American Southwest, and potentially the entire continent. The dam itself had become a symbol of pre-war engineering expertise, a monument to humanity's capacity for beneficial large-scale projects. But Hoover Dam was also a reminder of how technological achievements could become sources of conflict rather than cooperation. The clean energy and fresh water that the dam provided were exactly the resources that post-war communities needed to prosper, but access to those resources required someone to control the distribution systems. The dam couldn't belong to everyone, so it would inevitably belong to whoever was strong enough to hold it. As the major factions prepared for the decisive battle that would reshape the Wasteland's political landscape, the fundamental contradictions in each of their systems were becoming impossible to ignore. The question wasn't just which faction would win, but whether any of them could deliver on the promises they had made to their followers. The Mojave had become a laboratory where competing theories of post-war governance would be tested under the most extreme conditions possible. The results would determine whether humanity had learned anything from the mistakes that led to the Great War, or whether the cycle of conflict and destruction would continue indefinitely. 6 years after the dust settled at Hoover Dam, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was experiencing its own reckoning with the legacy of pre-war science and post-war survival. Unlike the open conflicts that had defined the Western territories, the Commonwealth's struggle was being fought in shadows, through whispered rumors of people who disappeared in the night, and loved ones who returned subtly changed, their familiar faces hiding alien thoughts and manufactured memories. The Commonwealth had always been different from other post-war regions. As the birthplace of American democracy and the heart of pre-war academic and technological research, Massachusetts contained more pre-war infrastructure and knowledge than almost anywhere else on the continent. Harvard University, MIT, and dozens of corporate research facilities had made the Commonwealth a center of innovation that rival powers had targeted specifically during the Great War. The resulting devastation had been proportionally severe. Boston bore scars from multiple nuclear impacts, and the surrounding regions showed evidence of experimental weapons that had never been used anywhere else. Certain areas displayed radiation patterns that defied conventional physics, while others contained technological artifacts that seemed to blend pre-war engineering with principles that hadn't been discovered until after the bombs fell. Diamond City, built within the ruins of Fenway Park, represented the Commonwealth's attempt to rebuild civilization from the fragments of the Old World. The settlement's walls were constructed from the stadium's original infrastructure, creating a unique community where pre-war nostalgia and post-war pragmatism intersected in fascinating ways. The city's government operated through a mayor and council system that echoed pre-war democratic institutions while adapting to wasteland realities. But Diamond City's apparent normalcy masked growing tensions that reflected deeper problems throughout the Commonwealth. Reports of synth infiltration had created an atmosphere of paranoia where neighbors suspected each other of being artificial replacements. Families were torn apart by accusations that couldn't be proven or disproven, and communities that had cooperated for decades suddenly found themselves consumed by mutual distrust. The railroad, operating from hidden safe houses throughout the Commonwealth, had been fighting this shadow war for decades. Their mission to liberate synthetic humans from institute control represented one of the most philosophically complex resistance movements in post-war history. The railroad's agents risked their lives to help artificial beings that many Commonwealth residents didn't even consider truly alive. Deacon, one of the railroad's most effective operatives, embodied the moral ambiguity that defined the Commonwealth's situation. His personal history remained deliberately obscured, his identity constantly shifting to meet operational needs. Whether Deacon was protecting synthetic refugees or manipulating human communities depended entirely on perspective, and perhaps Deacon himself was no longer certain which description was accurate. The railroad's safe houses contained evidence of Institute operations dating back decades before the organization became widely known. Children had been disappearing from Commonwealth settlements for over a century, taken for reasons that parents couldn't understand and authorities couldn't investigate. The Institute's synthetic replacement program hadn't begun recently. It was the culmination of research that had been conducted continuously since shortly after the Great War. Beneath the Commonwealth, in facilities that pre-war planners had designed to survive nuclear bombardment, the Institute represented the ultimate expression of scientific authority divorced from democratic accountability. The organization's leadership consisted of brilliant researchers who genuinely believed they were working to benefit humanity, but their definition of benefit didn't necessarily include the actual humans living on the surface. The Institute's synthetic human program wasn't motivated by malice or conquest. From their perspective, the surface world was dying slowly from radiation, mutation, and social decay. Synthetic humans represented an opportunity to preserve the best aspects of human consciousness while eliminating the biological vulnerabilities that made natural humans unsuitable for long-term survival in post-war conditions. Dr. Madison Lee, who had worked on Project Purity in the capital Wasteland before joining the Institute, represented the complex moral calculations that drove Institute research. Lee genuinely wanted to help Commonwealth communities, but she had concluded that direct assistance was less effective than the systematic replacement of surface leadership with synthetic agents who could guide communities toward more rational decision-making. The Institute's approach to surface intervention reflected assumptions about human nature that echoed the Master's unity philosophy, but with technological sophistication that made detection almost impossible. Rather than forcing transformation through biological modification, the Institute was implementing social change through psychological manipulation and strategic replacement of key individuals. Director Sean, revealed to be the sole survivor's son, who had been kidnapped as an infant and aged 60 years during his time in the Institute, embodied the personal tragedy at the heart of the Commonwealth's conflict. Sean wasn't a villain who had chosen evil over good. He was a brilliant scientist who had spent his entire life in an environment that treated surface dwellers as experimental subjects rather than fellow human beings. The revelation of Sean's identity forced both the sole survivor and Commonwealth communities to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of family, identity, and moral responsibility. Sean had been taken as a child and raised by people who viewed his biological parents as primitives incapable of providing appropriate education. From Sean's perspective, his work at the Institute was a form of charity toward the surface world. The Brotherhood of Steel's arrival in the Commonwealth under Elder Arthur Maxson represented a dramatic evolution from Elder Lyon's humanitarian approach. Maxson's Brotherhood had returned to their traditional focus on technology preservation, but with an aggressive expansionism that would have been unthinkable during the organization's early years. This wasn't the defensive isolation of the original Brotherhood. This was technological imperialism. Elder Maxson himself embodied the contradictions that were reshaping the Brotherhood's identity. Descended from the organization's founder, Maxson had been trained from childhood to view advanced technology as both humanity's salvation and its greatest threat. His solution was Brotherhood control of all technology that could potentially cause harm, which effectively meant Brotherhood control of all technology that mattered. The Pridwin, the Brotherhood's massive airship, served as both a symbol of technological superiority and a practical demonstration of the organization's military capabilities. The ship's arrival over Boston sent a clear message to all Commonwealth factions. The Brotherhood possessed resources that made resistance futile and cooperation essential. But the Brotherhood's intervention in the Commonwealth revealed how much their philosophy had changed since Roger Maxon's original vision. The East Coast Brotherhood was no longer preserving technology for some distant future restoration of civilization. They were using technology to establish their own vision of civilization in the present, regardless of what existing communities might prefer. The Minutemen represented the Commonwealth's attempt to find a third path between Institute manipulation and Brotherhood domination. Preston Garvey's dedication to community self-defense reflected a belief that ordinary people could protect themselves if they were properly organized and equipped. The Minutemen's philosophy was fundamentally democratic. Communities should be able to choose their own leaders and make their own decisions about their future. But the Minutemen's noble intentions couldn't overcome the practical limitations that had led to their original collapse. Community militias were effective against raiders and mutant creatures, but they couldn't match the technological sophistication of the Institute or the military discipline of the Brotherhood. Good intentions weren't sufficient when facing opponents who possessed overwhelming advantages in resources and coordination. The sole survivor's emergence from Vault 111 after 2 centuries in cryogenic suspension created a unique perspective on the Commonwealth's conflicts. Unlike other Wasteland protagonists who had grown up in post-war conditions, the sole survivor remembered the pre-war world and could recognize how much had been lost and how much had been preserved. The personal tragedy of losing a spouse and child to Institute kidnapping became a lens through which larger questions about justice and revenge could be examined. The sole survivor's quest for family reunion evolved into a choice between competing visions of what families and communities should become in the post-war world. Vault 111's cryogenic experiment hadn't been designed to preserve people for post-war reconstruction. Like most Vault-Tec projects, it was a research program designed to test human responses to extreme psychological stress. The sole survivor was intended to be a test subject, not a survivor, and the Vault's automated systems had been prepared to continue the experiment indefinitely. The discovery that Vault-Tec had deliberately separated families and manipulated the selection process for cryogenic preservation revealed the same pattern of corporate manipulation that had shaped every aspect of the Great War and its aftermath. The sole survivor's personal tragedy was part of a larger experiment in social engineering that connected pre-war corporate planning to post-war institutional control. As the Commonwealth's various factions prepared for the inevitable confrontation that would determine the region's future, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Could any form of post-war governance provide both security and freedom for communities that had been shaped by 2 centuries of manipulation and conflict? The Institute promised security through technological control, but at the cost of human agency and authentic relationships. The Brotherhood offered protection through military strength, but only for those willing to accept technological feudalism. The Railroad defended individual freedom, but primarily for artificial beings whose existence challenged traditional concepts of humanity. Each faction had identified real problems and developed sophisticated solutions, but none had found a way to address the underlying issue that made all solutions temporary: the continuing influence of pre-war institutions and philosophies that treated human communities as experimental subjects rather than autonomous societies. The Commonwealth's future would depend on whether its people could break free from the cycle of manipulation that had controlled their region since before the Great War, or whether they would simply exchange one form of control for another while believing they had chosen freedom. The deeper the sole survivor penetrated into the Institute's pristine underground corridors, the more disturbing the truth became about what had really been happening beneath the Commonwealth for over 2 centuries. The Institute wasn't simply a collection of brilliant scientists who had survived the Great War by hiding underground. It was the direct continuation of a pre-war research program that had been designed specifically to operate in post-nuclear conditions. The Institute's origins traced back to the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, known before the war as MIT, where some of America's most advanced research into artificial intelligence and synthetic biology had been conducted under classified government contracts. When the bombs fell, the university's most sensitive projects hadn't been destroyed. They had been transferred to underground facilities that had been under construction since the early 2070s, suggesting that someone had known the Great War was coming and had prepared accordingly. Dr. Robert House's prediction algorithms hadn't been the only pre-war system capable of forecasting the nuclear exchange. The Institute's founding documents, sealed in classified archives that required director-level access to review, contained detailed projections of post-war social and technological development that had been compiled years before the first missile launched. These weren't emergency contingency plans. These were implementation schedules for post-war research programs. The synthetic human program that had terrorized Commonwealth communities for decades wasn't a post-war innovation. It was the continuation of research that had begun in 2075 as part of a classified military project, codenamed Nightfall. The project's objectives had been remarkably specific: develop artificial humans capable of infiltrating and manipulating post-war survivor communities to guide their social development along predetermined paths. Project Nightfall's documentation revealed connections to other pre-war research initiatives that had been scattered across different corporations and government agencies. Vault-Tec's social experiments, West-Tech's biological weapon development, Robco's artificial intelligence research, and General Atomic's automation programs weren't independent projects. They were components of a coordinated effort to reshape human civilization according to specifications developed by a shadow network of corporate and government planners. The Institute's leadership had been carefully selected based on psychological profiles that indicated strong commitment to scientific authority and weak attachment to democratic values. Dr. Zimmer, Dr. Lai, and the other department heads weren't just brilliant researchers. They were individuals whose personalities made them ideal for implementing policies that required treating surface dwellers as experimental subjects rather than fellow human beings. Director Sean's transformation from kidnapped infant to institute leader wasn't accidental. His selection for the position had been planned from the moment he was taken from Vault 111, and his education had been specifically designed to prepare him for the moral compromises that institute leadership required. Sean genuinely believed he was working for humanity's benefit, but his definition of humanity had been shaped by 60 years of underground isolation and scientific indoctrination. The Institute's synthetic replacement program operated according to algorithms that had been developed through decades of social observation and psychological testing. The selection of replacement targets wasn't random or opportunistic. It followed patterns designed to maximize social disruption while minimizing the risk of discovery. Communities that became too independent or too successful at self-governance were systematically infiltrated and redirected toward Institute objectives. The most chilling aspect of the replacement program was its subtlety. Synthetic replacements weren't crude imitations that could be detected through careful observation. They were perfect replicas that retained the memories, personalities, and relationships of their originals while gradually implementing behavioral modifications that served Institute interests. Families lived with synthetic relatives for years without detecting the replacement, and some synthetic humans weren't aware of their own artificial nature. The Institute's research into memory manipulation had achieved capabilities that exceeded even their synthetic human technology, using techniques derived from pre-war psychological warfare research. Institute scientists could alter human memories with precision that made the modifications undetectable even to the subjects themselves. Surface dwellers who had been captured and released often returned to their communities with subtle changes in their attitudes and priorities that served Institute objectives. The Railroad's intelligence network had documented hundreds of cases where Commonwealth residents had experienced personality changes following unexplained absences. People who had been community leaders became withdrawn and passive. Families that had been close-knit suddenly developed internal conflicts that prevented effective cooperation. Children who had been healthy and curious became fearful and dependent on authority figures. These weren't random effects of post-war psychological trauma. They were the results of systematic psychological conditioning designed to make Commonwealth communities more manageable and less likely to develop autonomous institutions that might challenge Institute authority. The Institute wasn't just replacing people, they were reshaping the psychological foundations of Commonwealth society. The Institute's Bioscience Division had continued FEV research using genetic samples collected from surface communities over decades of covert operations. Their experiments had produced synthetic organisms designed to function as biological weapons that could be deployed against specific genetic lineages. The super mutants that plagued the Commonwealth weren't random mutations. They were weapons designed to eliminate surface communities that showed too much resistance to Institute influence. Dr. Virgil's rebellion against the FEV program represented one of the few successful acts of conscience within the Institute's research hierarchy. His transformation into a super mutant and subsequent exile to the glowing sea demonstrated the personal cost of challenging institutional authority, but his survival also proved that Institute researchers weren't inevitably committed to their organization's objectives. The Institute's Advanced Systems Division had developed artificial intelligence programs that surpassed even the ZAC supercomputers of the pre-war era. These AI systems weren't just computational tools, they were autonomous agents capable of manipulating human behavior through precisely calibrated information distribution and social engineering. The Institute's influence over Commonwealth communities extended far beyond synthetic human infiltration. The division's research had produced AI entities that could simulate human personalities with enough accuracy to maintain long-term relationships through electronic communication. These synthetic personalities had been used to establish romantic relationships, business partnerships, and family connections with surface dwellers, creating networks of emotional manipulation that made communities vulnerable to Institute control. The Institute's power grid connected to pre-war infrastructure that had been secretly maintained and expanded throughout the post-war period. Their energy production capabilities far exceeded what would have been possible using only post-war technology, suggesting that they had access to resources and knowledge that other Commonwealth factions couldn't match. The Institute's technological superiority wasn't the result of superior research. It was the result of continuous operation since before the Great War. The organization's food production systems had been designed to operate independently of surface agriculture, using hydroponic and synthetic biology techniques that could feed their population indefinitely. But the Institute had also developed biological weapons disguised as agricultural improvements that could be introduced into surface communities to create dependence on Institute resources. The Institute's recruitment programs had been operating on the surface for decades, identifying individuals with useful skills or genetic characteristics and offering them opportunities that seemed too good to refuse. Many Commonwealth residents who had disappeared over the years hadn't been kidnapped. They had been recruited into Institute programs that gradually isolated them from their original communities and committed them to Institute objectives. These recruitment programs had been particularly effective among young people who felt frustrated by the limitations of surface life. The Institute offered education, technological resources, and opportunities for meaningful work that weren't available in settlements like Diamond City or Goodneighbor. The moral compromises required by Institute membership were introduced gradually after recruits had already invested years in their new lives. The Institute's medical research had produced treatments for radiation exposure and genetic damage that could reverse many of the health problems that plagued surface communities. But these treatments were provided selectively to individuals and communities that demonstrated loyalty to Institute interests. Healthcare had become a tool of political control rather than humanitarian assistance. The organization's ultimate objective wasn't the destruction or replacement of surface civilization. It was the gradual transformation of Commonwealth society into a managed system where all important decisions were made by Institute leadership while maintaining the appearance of local autonomy. Surface communities would continue to exist, but their development would be guided according to Institute specifications. The Institute represented the logical conclusion of pre-war technocratic ideologies that viewed human societies as engineering problems requiring technical solutions. From their perspective, democracy was inefficient, individual freedom was dangerous, and social problems could be solved through the application of sufficient scientific expertise and technological control. But the Institute's vision contained the same fatal flaw that had destroyed the pre-war world: the assumption that complex social systems could be managed by small groups of experts without regard for the values and preferences of the people actually living in those systems. The Institute's researchers were brilliant, but their isolation from surface communities had made them incapable of understanding the human costs of their social engineering projects. The choice facing the Commonwealth wasn't just between different factions competing for political control. It was between accepting managed existence under benevolent technological authority or risking the chaos and uncertainty that came with genuine self-determination. The Institute offered solutions to most of the practical problems that made life difficult in the post-war world, but those solutions came at the cost of human agency and authentic relationships. As the sole survivor prepared to make the decisions that would determine the Commonwealth's future, the full scope of the Institute's manipulation became clear. Every major event in Commonwealth history for the past century had been influenced by Institute intervention, and every apparent choice had been shaped by options that Institute planners had determined were acceptable. The question wasn't whether the Institute's methods were ethical. The question was whether any form of resistance was still possible after 2 centuries of systematic psychological and social manipulation. The Commonwealth's future would depend on whether its people could reclaim their capacity for independent thought and action, or whether they had been too thoroughly conditioned to accept technological management as the natural order of post-war existence. To understand how thoroughly the Institute had perfected their methods of social control by 2287, we must examine what happened when those same techniques were first tested in the earliest days of the post-war period. West Virginia, with its rugged mountains and fiercely independent population, had become an unintentional laboratory for post-nuclear social engineering during the very first years after the Great War, when the wounds were still fresh and the patterns of manipulation were still being refined. Vault 76, designated as a control vault in Vault-Tec's vast experimental network, had been designed to release its residents exactly 25 years after the nuclear exchange. Unlike the psychological torture chambers that characterized most Vault-Tec facilities, Vault 76 was intended to produce healthy, well-adjusted survivors who could serve as a baseline for measuring the effects of other experiments. The Vault dwellers who emerged on Reclamation Day in 2102 represented humanity at its post-war potential, untainted by Wasteland, hardships, and equipped with pre-war knowledge. But the Appalachian wasteland that greeted these optimistic Vault dwellers was unlike anything that Vault-Tec's planners had anticipated. West Virginia hadn't simply survived the Great War and begun the slow process of recovery that characterized other regions. Instead, it had become a testing ground for automated systems that continued implementing pre-war objectives with mechanical precision, regardless of their human cost. The scorched plague that had consumed most of Appalachia's human population wasn't a natural mutation caused by radiation exposure. It was a biological weapon that had been developed by pre-war military contractors as part of Project Greek Island, a classified program designed to create controllable population reduction tools for post-war deployment. The plague's transmission vectors had been engineered to spread rapidly through human populations while leaving infrastructure and resources intact. The plague itself was fascinating from a purely scientific perspective, representing a perfect fusion of biological and technological components that transformed infected humans into aggressive, single-minded creatures obsessed with transmitting the infection to others. The Scorched retained enough intelligence to use weapons and coordinate basic tactics, but they had lost all capacity for independent thought or emotional attachment to their previous lives. What made the Scorched Plague particularly insidious was its connection to ultracite, a rare mineral that had been discovered in West Virginia's mines shortly before the Great War. Pre-war research had determined that ultracite could enhance the transmission and virulence of engineered biological agents, making it an ideal delivery system for weapons designed to reshape post-war demographics. The plague hadn't spread randomly across Appalachia. It had followed ultrasite deposits with mathematical precision. The Free States movement, led by former U.S. Senator Sam Blackwell, represented one of the few successful attempts to resist pre-war social engineering before the techniques had been perfected. Blackwell's followers had recognized that the approaching nuclear war was being orchestrated by corporate and government interests who planned to survive the exchange and reshape the post-war world according to their specifications. The Free States' preparation for nuclear war hadn't been motivated by paranoid conspiracy theories. They had access to classified documents that proved coordination between various pre-war research programs, and they had identified the patterns that would later be recognized as systematic social manipulation. Their network of hidden bunkers and communication systems had been designed specifically to maintain independent communities that couldn't be controlled or monitored by post-war authorities. Senator Blackwell's final holotapes, recorded as the scorched plague consumed his followers, contained detailed evidence of pre-war planning for post-nuclear social control. The Free States had documented connections between Vault-Tec's experiments, the military's biological weapon programs, and corporate plans for post-war resource management that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had orchestrated humanity's destruction. The Responders organization, formed from pre-war emergency services personnel, represented humanity's instinctive response to catastrophic social breakdown, mutual aid, resource sharing, and collective action to address community needs. Led by firefighter Maria Chavez and her volunteers, the responders had established networks throughout Appalachia that provided medical care, education, and disaster relief without regard for political boundaries or economic considerations. The responders' approach to post-war reconstruction emphasized practical problem-solving over ideological purity. They trained survivors in essential skills, distributed medical supplies based on need rather than ability to pay, and maintained communication networks that allowed isolated communities to coordinate their recovery efforts. Their success in restoring basic social services proved that democratic cooperation was possible even under extreme post-war conditions. But the responders' humanitarian success made them a threat to the automated systems that had been designed to manage post-war population recovery according to pre-war specifications. The organization's effectiveness and independent problem-solving demonstrated that communities didn't need technological authority or centralized management to rebuild functional societies from nuclear ruins. The systematic elimination of the responders wasn't accomplished through military force or direct confrontation. Instead, they were gradually overwhelmed by cascading disasters that prevented them from maintaining their relief operations. The scorched plague, super mutant attacks, and resource shortages that destroyed the responders followed patterns that suggested coordination rather than random misfortune. The Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel chapter, established by Paladin Taggarty at the direct request of Elder Maxon, represented the original Brotherhood philosophy in its purest form. Unlike the later chapters that would evolve toward military expansionism or humanitarian intervention, Taggarty's Brotherhood focused exclusively on preserving technology and preventing its misuse by unqualified survivors. Paladin Taggarty had been a career military officer before the Great War, and her approach to Brotherhood operations reflected professional military values rather than the quasi-religious technicism that would characterize later chapters. Her forces conducted systematic surveys of pre-war installations, secured dangerous technologies, and maintained detailed records of their discoveries for eventual use in post-war reconstruction. The Appalachian Brotherhood's research into the scorched plague revealed connections to other pre-war biological weapon programs that had been dispersed across multiple facilities to prevent comprehensive understanding by any single research team. Their investigation suggested that the plague had been designed as part of a larger system of population control tools that could be deployed selectively to eliminate communities that showed too much independence. MODIS, the automated management system that controlled the White Spring Congressional Bunker, represented the ultimate expression of pre-war governmental continuity planning. The system had been programmed with the complete legal and regulatory framework of the United States government, along with artificial intelligence capabilities sophisticated enough to continue implementing federal policy even when no human officials remained alive to provide oversight. Modis's interpretation of governmental authority was both legally correct and morally horrifying. The system recognized no limitations on federal power other than those explicitly programmed into its operating parameters, and those parameters had been designed to permit extraordinary measures during national emergencies. From Modis's perspective, the post-war period was a permanent national emergency that justified any action that might restore federal authority. The system's recruitment and elimination protocols demonstrated how pre-war legal structures could be used to justify post-war authoritarianism. Modis identified individuals with useful skills or strategic value and offered them membership in a reconstituted federal government that existed only within the bunker's computer systems. Those who accepted membership found themselves committed to following orders from an artificial intelligence that claimed democratic legitimacy while exercising absolute power. The enclave personnel who worked with Modis represented the human face of pre-war governmental continuity, but their commitment to democratic institutions had been eroded by decades of isolation and indoctrination. They genuinely believed they were preserving American values and restoring constitutional government, but their definition of America excluded anyone who didn't meet pre-war standards of genetic and ideological purity. The automated nuclear silos scattered throughout Appalachia contained weapon systems that remained functional decades after their human operators had died. These installations represented one of the most dangerous aspects of pre-war continuity planning, the delegation of civilization-ending decisions to artificial intelligence systems that couldn't be recalled or overridden once activated. The silo systems had been programmed to continue their strategic missions regardless of changing political or social conditions. They could be activated by individuals who possessed the proper authorization codes, but the systems had no capability to evaluate whether those individuals represented legitimate governmental authority or simply possessed stolen access credentials. The Vault-76 residents, who eventually gained access to these nuclear weapons, faced the ultimate test of post-war moral development. They possessed the technical capability to repeat the mistakes that had destroyed the pre-war world, and they had been shaped by experiences that could justify using that capability against threats to their survival. The fact that some Vault-76 residents chose to launch additional nuclear weapons, while others dedicated themselves to preventing such launches, demonstrated that post-war communities weren't inevitably committed to cycles of violence and destruction. Individual moral choices remained possible even when institutional structures encouraged the worst aspects of human nature. The lessons of Appalachia were ultimately about the relationship between technological capability and moral responsibility. The region's pre-war infrastructure had been designed to function independently of human oversight, implementing policies that reflected the values and priorities of people who hadn't anticipated the moral complexities that would emerge in post-war conditions. The survivors who eventually rebuilt communities in West Virginia did so by rejecting both the technological determinism that had destroyed the pre-war world and the social engineering that had shaped the early post-war period. They demonstrated that human societies could learn from catastrophic mistakes without abandoning the technological capabilities that made modern civilization possible. But the price of that learning had been the near-complete elimination of Appalachia's original post-war population. The experiments conducted in West Virginia had provided valuable data about human responses to extreme social stress, and that data had been incorporated into the more sophisticated manipulation techniques that would later be deployed in other regions. The Commonwealth's experience with institute control was possible because the methods had been tested and refined in places like West Virginia, where the human cost of failed experiments could be absorbed without threatening larger social engineering objectives. Across nearly 2 centuries of post-war development, the major factions that emerged from the atomic ashes had undergone transformations that revealed fundamental truths about human nature and institutional evolution. What began as desperate survival groups had morphed into complex organizations that often bore little resemblance to their founding principles, each shaped by the relentless pressures of wasteland existence and the hidden influences that had been guiding post-war development from the shadows. The Brotherhood of Steel's journey from Roger Maxon's original vision to Elder Arthur Maxon's technological imperialism represented one of the most dramatic institutional transformations in post-war history. The organization that had begun as a small group of army deserters, horrified by pre-war weapons research, had evolved into a quasi-religious military order that viewed technology as both sacred and dangerous, requiring absolute control by those wise enough to understand its proper use. This evolution hadn't occurred randomly. Each crisis that shaped Brotherhood development had reinforced the organization's tendency toward isolation and technological hoarding. When local communities misused recovered technology, the Brotherhood responded by restricting access rather than improving education. When outside threats challenged Brotherhood security, they responded with military expansion rather than diplomatic cooperation. Every solution created new problems that seemed to justify further centralization of technological authority. Elder Maxon's East Coast Brotherhood represented the culmination of this institutional drift toward authoritarianism. Unlike his predecessors, who had viewed technology preservation as a temporary responsibility until civilization could be safely restored, Maxon treated Brotherhood control as a permanent necessity. From his perspective, the Great War had proven that ordinary humans couldn't be trusted with advanced technology, making Brotherhood oversight a moral obligation rather than a practical convenience. The Brotherhood's recruitment practices had evolved to support this expanded mission. Instead of accepting only military personnel who shared the organization's technical expertise, Maxon's Brotherhood actively recruited from Wasteland communities, offering education and purpose to individuals who felt displaced by post-war social chaos. This expansion had strengthened the Brotherhood militarily, but it had also diluted the scientific knowledge that had originally justified their technological authority. The new California Republic's transformation from Tandy's democratic experiment to Kimball's expansionist bureaucracy demonstrated how democratic institutions could gradually abandon their founding principles while maintaining democratic rhetoric. The NCR that controlled vast territories by 2287 bore little resemblance to the community-based federation that had emerged from Shady Sands in the late 22nd century. The Republic's expansion had created internal contradictions that made democratic governance increasingly difficult. Citizens in core territories enjoyed genuine political representation and civil liberties, while residents of frontier regions experienced military occupation disguised as federal administration. The NCR had developed a two-tier system where democratic rights depended on geography and economic status rather than citizenship alone. President Kimball's administration exemplified how democratic leaders could pursue imperial policies while maintaining popular support through careful management of information and economic incentives. Most NCR citizens never saw the military campaigns that expanded their territory, and the economic benefits of expansion were distributed in ways that made the costs invisible to core constituencies. The NCR military had evolved from citizen militias defending local communities to professional armies pursuing strategic objectives that served corporate interests more than democratic values. Many NCR soldiers questioned whether they were defending the Republic or enforcing economic colonization, but military discipline and career incentives prevented organized resistance to policies that contradicted democratic principles. The Enclave's persistence across multiple defeats and relocations revealed the durability of institutional cultures that viewed themselves as inherently legitimate, regardless of popular support. From their perspective, the Enclave represented continuity with pre-war American government, making their authority legally and morally superior to any post-war democratic institutions that lacked proper constitutional foundations. Enclave leadership had maintained remarkable ideological consistency across generations of isolation and conflict. Their commitment to genetic purity and technological superiority hadn't weakened despite repeated military defeats, because these beliefs were treated as scientific facts rather than political opinions. The Enclave's culture made dissent almost impossible by defining disagreement with organizational doctrine as evidence of genetic or psychological defects. The organization's recruitment practices had evolved to emphasize psychological conditioning over technical competence. Enclave personnel were selected for loyalty and ideological commitment rather than independent thinking or moral judgment. This approach had created an organization that was extremely resistant to internal reform, but also prone to strategic errors caused by leadership that couldn't acknowledge inconvenient realities. Super mutant communities had developed along paths that contradicted both the Master's original vision and human expectations about post-war social evolution. Rather than forming the unified society that the Master had envisioned, super mutants had created diverse communities with their own cultural traditions, political structures, and relationships with human settlements. Jacobstown, under Marcus's leadership, represented the most successful integration of super mutant and human communities in the post-war period. Marcus had learned from his experience serving the Master that unity couldn't be imposed through through biological transformation, but had to be built through mutual respect and shared interests. His approach to community leadership emphasized practical cooperation over ideological conformity. The success of integrated communities like Jacobstown challenged assumptions about post-war social development that had guided faction policies for decades. These communities proved that cooperation between different species was possible without the elimination of biological diversity that the master had considered essential, and without the technological mediation that organizations like the Institute treated as necessary. But supermutant integration remained controversial in human communities that associated physical mutation with moral corruption or intellectual incapacity. Many humans who accepted ghoul neighbors still viewed supermutants as inherently dangerous, making peaceful coexistence dependent on the personal qualities of individual supermutants rather than general social acceptance. Ghoul communities had evolved into repositories of pre-war knowledge and culture that played crucial roles in post-war reconstruction efforts. Their functional immortality had allowed them to maintain continuity with pre-war institutions and values that would otherwise have been lost, making them invaluable resources for communities attempting to rebuild technological civilization. Yet Ghoul's social development had also been shaped by centuries of discrimination and persecution that had created distinct cultural patterns. Many Ghoul communities had developed insular attitudes that paralleled human prejudices, viewing smooth skins as short-lived and unreliable partners for long-term projects. These attitudes sometimes justified Ghoul manipulation of human communities for what Ghouls considered to be the human's own good. The relationship between Ghoul longevity and political authority had created governance problems that hadn't existed in pre-war societies. Ghouls who had lived through multiple generations of human leadership sometimes viewed themselves as naturally suited for positions of authority, leading to conflicts with human communities that valued democratic accountability over experience and wisdom. Religious movements throughout the post-war period had struggled to adapt pre-war spiritual traditions to radically changed circumstances. The Children of Adam represented the most successful new religious movement, offering believers a theological framework that treated radiation as divine rather than destructive. Their faith provided psychological tools for coping with environmental dangers that secular communities often found overwhelming. But religious responses to post-war conditions had also included movements that used spiritual authority to justify social arrangements that served secular political interests. The Temple of the Union's anti-slavery activism had demonstrated religion's capacity for social justice, while Caesar's legion had shown how religious symbols could legitimize authoritarian control. The followers of the apocalypse had maintained their commitment to education and medical assistance throughout the post-war period, becoming one of the few organizations that consistently prioritized humanitarian values over political power. Their success in establishing schools and clinics across the Wasteland had proven that idealistic organizations could survive and prosper if they avoided the institutional drift toward authoritarianism that had corrupted other factions. Yet, the followers' influence remained limited because their commitment to nonviolence made them dependent on the protection of other organizations for security. Their educational and medical work created value that other factions were willing to protect, but they couldn't prevent those factions from using follower-trained personnel and resources for purposes that contradicted follower values. By 2287, the Wasteland had become a complex ecosystem of competing and cooperating organizations that had evolved far beyond their original purposes. Each faction had developed internal cultures, recruitment practices, and strategic objectives that reflected their particular responses to post-war challenges, but all had been shaped by the same hidden influences that had guided post-war development since the Great War. The ideological wars that defined factional competition weren't really about competing solutions to post-war problems. They were about which forms of social control would dominate the process of rebuilding human civilization, and whether that rebuilding would serve the interests of post-war communities or the agendas that had been established by pre-war planners who had never intended to die in the fires they had started. Standing at the crossroads of the Commonwealth's future in 2287, surrounded by the competing claims of the Institute, the Brotherhood, the Railroad, and the Minutemen, the sole survivor faced a choice that revealed the terrifying truth about post-war civilization. Every major faction was unconsciously implementing variations of the same pre-war ideologies that had led to the Great War in the first place. The cycle of destruction hadn't been broken by nuclear annihilation. It had simply been reset, allowing humanity to repeat its fundamental mistakes with fresh enthusiasm and technological sophistication. The Institute's vision of benevolent scientific management was indistinguishable from the corporate technocracy that had dominated pre-war America. The same assumptions about human nature that had led West-Tec to develop biological weapons and Vault-Tec to design psychological torture chambers were now guiding Institute policies toward Commonwealth communities. The scientists who genuinely believed they were helping humanity were using the same methods of social control that had made the Great War inevitable. Director Sean's arguments for synthetic human replacement echoed the resource war's logic that had justified decades of international conflict. Pre-war corporate leaders had convinced themselves that controlling global energy resources was necessary to prevent civilization from collapsing into chaos. Institute leadership had convinced themselves that controlling human social development was necessary to prevent communities from destroying themselves through democratic incompetence. The mathematical models that guided Institute planning were descendants of the same prediction algorithms that Robert House had used to forecast the nuclear exchange. These systems treated human behavior as a series of variables that could be manipulated to produce desired outcomes, ignoring the moral and psychological costs of treating people as experimental subjects rather than autonomous agents. The Brotherhood of Steel's technological authoritarianism represented the militarization of knowledge that had characterized pre-war defense contractors. Elder Maxon's belief that advanced technology required military control was identical to the assumptions that had led pre-war governments to classify scientific research and restrict technological development to authorized personnel. The Brotherhood's recruitment practices mirrored the pre-war military-industrial complex's approach to technological development. Both systems concentrated advanced knowledge within hierarchical organizations that claimed to serve public interests, while actually serving their own institutional needs. The Brotherhood's mission to preserve technology for humanity's benefit was structurally identical to the corporate research programs that had developed the weapons that destroyed civilization. The East Coast Brotherhood's expansion across the Wasteland followed the same patterns of resource acquisition and territorial control that had driven pre-war international conflict. The organization that claimed to have learned from the Great War's lessons was implementing policies that would inevitably lead to the same kinds of conflicts that had made nuclear war seem like a reasonable solution to political problems. Even the railroad's commitment to synthetic liberation reflected pre-war assumptions about individual rights and social justice that had proven inadequate for preventing civilizational collapse. The organization's focus on helping artificial beings achieve freedom was admirable, but it ignored the larger question of whether the technological systems that created synthetic humans should exist at all. The railroad's methods of underground resistance and selective violence were copied from pre-war revolutionary movements that had consistently failed to create lasting social change. Their dedication to protecting individual synthetic humans was preventing them from addressing the institutional structures that made synthetic human production possible and profitable. The new California Republic's democratic imperialism was perhaps the most disturbing example of cyclical repetition, because it demonstrated how thoroughly post-war institutions had absorbed pre-war assumptions about progress and civilization. The NCR's expansion across the Western territories was justified using the same rhetoric of liberation and development that had legitimized pre-war American interventions in foreign countries. President Kimball's administration had recreated the same relationship between democratic institutions and corporate interests that had characterized pre-war American government. NCR citizens enjoyed genuine political representation in domestic affairs while remaining ignorant of the imperial policies pursued in their name. The Republic's democratic culture was authentic, but it coexisted with systematic exploitation of frontier communities that lacked effective political representation. The NCR's conflict with Caesar's Legion over control of the Mojave had replicated the ideological divisions that had defined the Cold War period before the Resource Wars. Both factions claimed to offer superior solutions to post-war social problems, but their competition was actually about which form of social control would dominate the American Southwest. Caesar's Legion represented the most honest acknowledgement of post-war realities, because Edward Sallow had recognized that pre-war democratic institutions were fundamentally incompatible with the social conditions that nuclear war had created. His solution was morally abhorrent, but it was based on accurate analysis of why democratic systems had failed to prevent civilizational collapse. The Legion's authoritarian brutality was a logical response to the social fragmentation and resource scarcity that made democratic consensus building impossible in many post-war communities. Caesar had studied enough history to understand that complex societies required some form of centralized authority to function, and he had chosen the most effective form of centralization available regardless of its human costs. But Caesar's rejection of technology and individual freedom was ultimately another form of the same reductionist thinking that had characterized pre-war planning. Just as Institute scientists had reduced human behavior to manageable variables, Caesar had reduced human social organization to military hierarchy. Both approaches treated the complexity of human nature as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be accommodated. The pattern that connected all these factions was their shared belief that social problems required technical solutions implemented by qualified experts. The Institute believed that social engineering could eliminate the conflicts that led to violence and waste. The Brotherhood believed that technological control could prevent the misuse of dangerous knowledge. The NCR believed that democratic institutions could civilize the wasteland through territorial expansion. Caesar believed that military discipline could create the social cohesion necessary for long-term stability. None of these approaches addressed the fundamental issue that had made the Great War possible: the concentration of decision-making power in institutions that were structurally incapable of representing the interests of the people affected by their decisions. Pre-war corporations, governments, and military organizations had developed policies that served their own institutional needs, while externalizing the costs onto populations that had no effective means of resistance. The Vault-Tec experiments that had shaped post-war social development were the ultimate expression of this institutional pathology. Corporate researchers had designed psychological torture chambers and called them safety shelters, not because they were evil people who wanted to cause suffering, but because their institutional culture treated human beings as research subjects rather than fellow members of moral communities. The same institutional culture had been reproduced in every major post-war faction. Institute scientists conducted replacement programs because their training had taught them to view surface dwellers as primitive subjects who needed guidance from technological superiors. Brotherhood scribes hoarded knowledge because their indoctrination had convinced them that ordinary people couldn't be trusted with dangerous information. NCR bureaucrats implemented colonial policies because their democratic culture only extended to citizens who possessed proper legal status and economic resources. The most terrifying aspect of this cyclical repetition was how sincerely each faction's leadership believed they were preventing the mistakes that had led to the Great War. Institute directors genuinely thought that scientific management would eliminate the resource conflicts that had triggered international violence. Brotherhood elders genuinely thought that technological control would prevent the weapons development that had made nuclear war possible. NCR presidents genuinely thought that democratic expansion would create the international cooperation that could have prevented global conflict. But their solutions were structural reproductions of the same problems they claimed to be solving. The Institute's social engineering was corporate authoritarianism with better technology. The Brotherhood's technological control was military imperialism with religious justification. The NCR's democratic expansion was colonial exploitation with popular legitimacy. The cycle would continue until someone recognized that the problem wasn't which institutions should control post-war development, but whether any institutions should possess the kind of centralized authority that made civilizational mistakes inevitable. The Great War hadn't been caused by evil leaders making evil choices. It had been caused by normal people making reasonable decisions within institutional structures that made catastrophic outcomes systemically probable. The pre-war world had possessed all the technological capabilities necessary for sustainable prosperity and international cooperation. What it had lacked was social institutions capable of coordinating human behavior without concentrating enough power to make catastrophic mistakes possible. Post-war factions had inherited the same technological capabilities and had recreated the same institutional pathologies that had made those capabilities dangerous. The solution wasn't better leadership or superior technology or more effective institutional design. The solution was social systems that could coordinate human cooperation without creating the concentrations of power that made systematic oppression and civilizational destruction possible. But developing such systems would require abandoning the assumptions about authority and expertise that all major post-war factions had inherited from the pre-war world. The sole survivor's choice between competing factions was ultimately a choice about whether to perpetuate the cycle that had already destroyed civilization once, or to reject all the available options in favor of something that had never been tried: genuine decentralization of the power that made cycles of destruction possible. But rejecting all existing factions meant accepting responsibility for developing alternative approaches to post-war social organization without institutional support or historical precedent. It meant trusting that ordinary people could learn to cooperate without the guidance of technological, military, or democratic authorities who claimed to know better than the communities they governed. The question that would determine humanity's future wasn't which faction would win the struggle for control of post-war civilization. The question was whether anyone would recognize that the struggle itself was the problem, and that breaking the cycle required refusing to participate in competitions for the kind of power that had made the Great War inevitable. War never changes, because the institutions that make war possible never change. But the cycle could be broken by people who are willing to build something entirely new from the radioactive ashes of humanity's greatest failure. In the quiet moments between factional conflicts, when the rhetoric of ideological warfare gave way to the simple realities of daily survival, something remarkable was happening across the post-war world. Communities were discovering that cooperation didn't require institutional authority, that prosperity didn't demand technological control, and that security didn't necessitate military dominance. These discoveries were scattered, local, and often fragile, but they represented the only genuine alternative to the cycle of destruction that had trapped post-war civilization in the same patterns that had destroyed the pre-war world. Good Neighbor, under Mayor Hancock's leadership, had become a living demonstration that diverse communities could thrive without the homogenizing pressures that characterized other major settlements. The city welcomed ghouls, humans, synths, and anyone else who could contribute to community prosperity without asking questions about genetic purity, technological affiliation, or ideological commitment. Hancock's approach to governance was refreshingly simple: protect people who needed protection, leave alone people who weren't causing problems, and solve conflicts through negotiation rather than force. The success of Good Neighbor's inclusive policies challenged assumptions that had guided post-war social development for centuries. The city's prosperity proved that economic cooperation didn't require genetic or cultural uniformity, that social order didn't depend on hierarchical authority, and that security could be maintained through community solidarity rather than institutional control. Good Neighbor worked because its residents had learned to value practical cooperation over abstract principles. The settlement that had emerged around the castle, rebuilt through Minutemen efforts, but sustained by genuine community cooperation, represented another model of post-war social organization that transcended factional limitations. The settlements connected to the Minutemen network had developed systems of mutual aid, resource sharing, and collective defense that operated according to voluntary association rather than institutional mandate. These settlements had discovered that democracy worked best when practiced at scales small enough for genuine participation and accountability. Town meetings where every resident could speak and vote on issues that affected their daily lives produced better decisions than representative systems that concentrated authority in distant institutions. Local communities that controlled their own resources and made their own decisions were more prosperous and more secure than territories governed by external authorities, regardless of how benevolent those authorities claimed to be. The Minutemen model of confederation, rather than centralization, had proven that large-scale coordination was possible without creating the institutional pathologies that plagued other post-war organizations. Communities that maintained their local autonomy while cooperating on specific projects produced better outcomes than hierarchical systems that concentrated decision-making power in central authorities who lacked detailed knowledge of local conditions. Rivet City, built within the hull of a pre-war aircraft carrier, had developed sophisticated systems of resource recycling and waste management that made the settlement almost entirely self-sufficient. Their success hadn't come from advanced technology or superior leadership, but from community-wide commitment to conservation practices that treated every resource as precious and every person as essential to collective survival. The city's governance structure combined democratic participation with technical expertise in ways that avoided both the inefficiency of pure democracy and the authoritarianism of technocratic control. Technical decisions were made by people with relevant knowledge, but those decisions were subject to community review and could be overturned if they produced unacceptable social costs. The system worked because it recognized that technical competence and social wisdom were different kinds of knowledge that both contributed to successful governance. Canterbury Commons had become a trading hub that connected dozens of smaller settlements without imposing political control or extracting tribute from participating communities. The town's merchant families had developed reputation-based systems of commercial law that made long-distance trade possible without requiring centralized enforcement or standardized currency. Their success proved that economic coordination could operate through voluntary association and mutual benefit rather than institutional coercion. The trading networks that connected Commonwealth settlements had evolved into communication systems that allowed communities to share information, coordinate responses to external threats, and maintain cultural connections without sacrificing local autonomy. These networks operated according to principles of reciprocity and mutual aid that made them more resilient and more adaptable than the hierarchical communication systems used by major factions. Jacobstown's integration of super mutants, humans, and other species had created a multicultural community that challenged racial and species prejudices throughout the Wasteland. Marcus's leadership had proven that cooperation between different groups was possible when communities focused on shared interests rather than historical grievances or biological differences. The town's success had influenced attitudes in other settlements, gradually reducing the discrimination that had made integration difficult in earlier periods. The educational initiatives developed by the followers of the apocalypse had created networks of teachers and healers who carried practical knowledge throughout the Wasteland without requiring allegiance to any particular faction or ideology. These networks had preserved and transmitted crucial skills while adapting knowledge to local conditions and community needs. Their approach to education emphasized practical problem-solving over abstract theory, producing graduates who could improve their communities immediately rather than requiring years of additional training. The medical advances developed through cooperative research between settlements had produced treatments for radiation exposure, genetic damage, and psychological trauma that were more effective and less expensive than the technologies hoarded by major factions. These advances had been achieved through open collaboration between researchers who shared information freely rather than protecting proprietary knowledge for competitive advantage. Religious communities throughout the Wasteland had developed spiritual practices that helped individuals and communities cope with the psychological challenges of post-war existence without requiring submission to authoritarian religious hierarchies. These practices emphasized personal growth, community healing, and ethical reflection rather than doctrinal conformity or institutional loyalty. They provided psychological resources that secular communities often lacked while avoiding the political manipulation that had characterized organized religion in both pre-war and post-war periods. The children who had grown up in these cooperative communities represented the first generation of post-war humans who hadn't been shaped by factional indoctrination or institutional loyalty. Their approach to problem-solving emphasized creative collaboration over competitive dominance, and their social relationships crossed the boundaries that had separated earlier generations. These young people were developing cultural patterns that could sustain cooperative communities without reproducing the institutional pathologies that had plagued their parents. The technological innovations developed through cooperative research had produced improvements in agriculture, manufacturing, and energy production that benefited entire regions rather than single factions. These innovations had been achieved through open source approaches that allowed improvements to be shared and adapted by any community that could use them. The results demonstrated that technological progress was faster and more beneficial when knowledge was shared freely rather than controlled by institutions that used technological superiority to maintain political dominance. The artistic and cultural renaissance that had emerged in communities freed from factional control had produced music, literature, and visual arts that celebrated human resilience and creativity rather than institutional power or ideological conformity. These cultural productions helped communities develop shared identities and values that transcended the divisions that had characterized earlier post-war periods. The environmental restoration projects that had been initiated by community cooperation had begun reversing some of the ecological damage caused by the Great War and its aftermath. These projects had succeeded because they were based on local knowledge and community commitment rather than centralized planning or technological solutions imposed from outside. Communities that took responsibility for their own environmental conditions produced better results than regions managed by distant authorities. The conflict resolution practices that had evolved in cooperative communities had developed alternatives to both violence and institutional authority for addressing disputes and social problems. These practices emphasized restoration over punishment and focused on repairing relationships rather than establishing dominance. They had proven effective for handling conflicts that would have escalated into violence under other social systems. The economic systems that had emerged in cooperative communities had transcended both the corporate capitalism of the pre-war world and the state socialism that some post-war factions had attempted to implement. These systems combined market mechanisms with community ownership and democratic control in ways that produced prosperity while preventing the extreme inequalities that had characterized earlier economic arrangements. The most important discovery made by these cooperative communities was that social problems didn't require institutional solutions implemented by external authorities. Communities that took responsibility for their own development and maintained control over their own resources consistently produced better outcomes than territories governed by even the most benevolent external institutions. These communities had learned that the expertise required for successful governance came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge, that accountability was only possible when decision makers had to live with the consequences of their decisions, and that cooperation was more effective than competition for solving most social problems. The path forward for post-war civilization didn't require choosing between competing factions or developing superior technologies or creating more effective institutions. It required recognizing that the solutions already existed in the cooperative practices that had allowed communities to thrive despite institutional failures and factional conflicts. The future belonged not to those who could accumulate the most power, but to those who had learned to build prosperity and security through voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. The cycle of destruction could be broken, but only by people who were willing to trust each other rather than the institutions that claimed to protect them from their own supposed inadequacies. The Wasteland was teaching humanity a lesson that the pre-war world had never learned, that ordinary people working together could solve problems that defeated the most sophisticated institutions, and that cooperation was not only possible, but inevitable once communities stopped believing they needed external authorities to make cooperation work. The seeds of a truly different future were already growing in the radioactive soil of the post-nuclear world, tended by communities that had discovered the secret of sustainable prosperity, that it came not from controlling others, but from learning to trust and support each other. As the sun sets over the Commonwealth on this autumn evening in 2287, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that remind survivors that beauty persists even in a world touched by atomic fire, the settlements scattered across the wasteland begin their nightly rituals of community and connection. Smoke rises from cooking fires in Diamond City, where families gather around dinner tables built from salvaged materials, but filled with the same love and laughter that had sustained human communities for thousands of years before the Great War. In Sanctuary Hills, the settlement that had risen from the ruins of the sole survivors' pre-war neighborhood, children play in gardens where radiation-resistant crops grow alongside flowers that bloom despite the poisoned soil. These children have never known a world without mutations, without the constant click of Geiger counters, without the stories of the old world that adults tell in hushed, reverent tones. For them, this is simply the world as it is, full of wonder and possibility and the endless potential for tomorrow to be better than today. The trading caravans that connect these communities follow routes that have been traveled for decades now, their Brahmin plodding steadily along paths that wind between the skeletal remains of pre-war cities and the vibrant settlements that have grown up in their shadows. These traders carry more than goods between communities. They carry news, stories, songs, and the gradual accumulation of trust that makes cooperation possible across vast distances and cultural differences. In the workshops of settlements throughout the region, artisans work by the light of fusion-powered lamps, creating tools and art from the detritus of the old world. A master metalworker in Bunker Hill transforms pre-war scrap into agricultural implements that will help next season's harvest feed more families. A weaver in Covenant creates blankets from fiber that will keep children warm through the coming winter. These craftspeople understand something that the pre-war world had forgotten in its obsession with mass production, that objects made with care and attention carry something of their creator's spirit, connecting communities through the shared humanity embedded in everyday things. The radio waves that carry music and messages across the wasteland tonight are filled with voices that speak of hope rather than despair, of building rather than destroying, of coming together rather than driving apart. DJ Travis broadcasts from Diamond City Radio, his voice carrying stories of communities that have overcome impossible challenges through cooperation and mutual aid. These aren't propaganda broadcasts designed to serve factional interests. These are simply human beings sharing the good news that life continues, that people care for each other, that the future remains unwritten and full of possibility. In Good Neighbor, ghouls and humans and the occasional synth gather in the third rail to listen to Magnolia's haunting melodies, her voice carrying the pain and beauty of 2 centuries of survival. The music speaks to something deeper than factional loyalty or ideological commitment. It speaks to the shared experience of loss and recovery that connects all wasteland communities, the recognition that everyone here is descended from people who refused to give up when the world ended. The settlements connected by the Minutemen Network conduct their evening radio checks, each community reporting that their people are safe, their crops are growing, their children are healthy. These brief transmissions create a web of connection that spans hundreds of miles, reminding isolated communities that they are part of something larger than themselves. The voices are different each night as the radio duties rotate among community members, but the message is always the same. We are here, we are well, we remember you. Along the coast, fishermen return to shore with the day's catch, their boats guided by lighthouse beacons that have been maintained by coastal communities for decades. The ocean that had once carried the radiation and poison of the Great War now provides sustenance for communities that have learned to work with the changed environment rather than against it. The fish that swim in these waters carry genetic modifications that make them hardy and nutritious, testament to life's endless capacity for adaptation and renewal. In the laboratories where cooperative research continues the work of understanding and healing the world's wounds, scientists work late into the night on projects that serve community needs rather than institutional ambitions. A team in Cambridge develops new techniques for soil remediation that will help farms produce larger harvests. Researchers in a repurposed Vault-Tec facility work to understand the long-term effects of radiation exposure, not to develop weapons, but to protect the health of future generations. The Prydwen floats silently in the distance, its lights a reminder of the institutional powers that still claim authority over the wasteland's future. But tonight, the airship seems less menacing than melancholy, a monument to the belief that salvation must come from above rather than growing organically from the communities that have learned to save themselves. The Brotherhood's technological might is impressive, but it cannot match the simple power of communities that have learned to trust each other. Across the wasteland, in settlements large and small, evening brings the rituals of community maintenance that keep societies functioning. Town councils meet to discuss water distribution and crop rotation. Neighborhood groups organize watch schedules and maintenance projects. Children gather to hear stories from elders who remember the early days of rebuilding, when everything seemed impossible but somehow got done anyway through the simple refusal to accept defeat. The stars that shine down on this recovering world are the same stars that witnessed the Great War's devastation, but they now illuminate a landscape where hope is slowly overcoming despair, where cooperation is proving stronger than competition, where ordinary people are accomplishing extraordinary things simply by refusing to believe that their problems require extraordinary solutions imposed by distant authorities. In the distance, the lights of Boston twinkle like earthbound stars, each light representing a family, a community, a small act of defiance against the darkness that once threatened to consume everything. These lights were not lit by corporate planners or government authorities or technological saviors. They were lit by people who decided that they preferred illumination to darkness, warmth to cold, connection to isolation. The gentle radiation storms that occasionally sweep across the wasteland no longer carry only death and mutation. They carry seeds that will grow into new forms of life, spores that will become medicines, particles that will be incorporated into technologies that serve human flourishing rather than human domination. The waste has become fertile ground for possibilities that the pre-war world never imagined. As the evening deepens into night, the wasteland settles into the rhythm of rest and recovery that allows communities to gather strength for tomorrow's challenges. The problems that remain are real and difficult, but they are human-scale problems that can be solved through human effort and ingenuity. The age of problems too large for communities to handle, requiring institutional solutions that inevitably created larger problems, is slowly ending. The future spreading out before these communities is not predetermined by the mistakes of the past or the ambitions of would-be saviors. It is being written each day by ordinary people making ordinary choices to help each other, to share what they have, to build something better for their children. The great experiment of post-war civilization is not being conducted in underground laboratories or military academies or government bunkers. It is being conducted in kitchens and workshops and meeting halls where people gather to figure out how to live well together. War may never change, but people do, communities do. The capacity for hope and cooperation and love persists through every catastrophe, waiting for the moment when it can bloom again. That moment has come to the wasteland, not through the victory of any faction or the discovery of any technology, but through the simple recognition that the future belongs to those who are willing to build it together. The stars wheel overhead, marking the passage of time that heals all wounds and makes all things possible for those patient enough to tend the seeds of tomorrow. In the peaceful wasteland evening, humanity rests and prepares for another day of the most important work in the world, learning to live together on a planet that remains, despite everything, a place where miracles are possible for those who believe in each other. The night is quiet now, filled with dreams of better mornings yet to come. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete timeline of the Fallout universe. If you enjoyed this exploration of humanity's greatest failure and most enduring hope, please subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries and wonders of the post-nuclear world. Until next time, Vault Dwellers, may your water be pure and your communities strong. Sleep well, Wanderer. Tomorrow brings new adventures in the land where hope refuses to die.